The crack of the rifle echoed across the Wyoming valley, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting the ground. Thomas Henderson lowered his Winchester, smoke still curling from the barrel. The would-be bandit lay motionless in the dirt road, blood spreading across his tattered Confederate coat. "You didn't have to kill him, Pa," Victoria Henderson said quietly, her knuckles white on the reins of their wagon. Thomas, a weathered man of 45, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that had seen too much death, reloaded his rifle with practiced efficiency. "3 men trying to rob our wagon. 1 down, 2 running. I'd call that mercy." His voice was flat, emotionless. "This is the 3rd one this year." Victoria's gaze swept across the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Wyoming Territory, 1875. Rolling hills covered with sagebrush stretched toward distant mountains, beautiful and merciless. This was supposed to be their promised land, but 3 years after settling it still felt like hostile territory. "We should report this to the sheriff in Redemption," she said, though they both knew the small settlement barely had law enforcement worthy of the name. Thomas climbed back onto the wagon seat beside his daughter. "There's no law out here, but what a man makes with his own hands." He took the reins from Victoria, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the fleeing robbers. "That's why I taught you to shoot, like I did." Victoria nodded, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sun. At 24, she was striking, rather than conventionally pretty, tall and strong from years of ranch work with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She could outshoot, outride, and outwork most men in the territory, skills that had earned her both admiration and resentment. As they approached their modest ranch house, Margaret Henderson emerged onto the porch, rifle in hand. At 42, she remained handsome, with the same auburn hair as her daughter, now streaked with silver. One look at their faces told her everything. "Another one?" she asked simply. Thomas nodded as he climbed down. "Just past Rattlesnake Creek. Tried to take the supplies." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her grip on the rifle tightened. "Go inside, Victoria. Your father and I will handle this." Victoria knew what that meant. They'd ride back, retrieve anything useful from the dead man, and bury him where they'd buried the others. No questions, no authorities. In the Wyoming Territory, justice was swift, brutal, and often administered personally. Inside the cabin, Victoria removed her riding gloves and hat, hanging them by the door. The interior was simple but comfortable, a testament to her mother's determination to create civilization in the wilderness. Handmade curtains softened the windows, a patchwork quilt covered the table, and shelves of books lined one wall. Treasures hauled across half a continent. Victoria poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the rough-hewn table, trying to steady her hands. 3 dead men this year alone. The wilderness was claiming its toll not just in hardship, but in humanity. She wondered if her father felt anything anymore when he pulled the trigger, or if the war had burned that part of him away forever. Her gaze fell on the daguerreotype in its silver frame herself, and Lieutenant Robert Ellsworth in his Union Army uniform, taken the day of their engagement in 1865. He'd never come home from the war, killed at Petersburg just weeks before the surrender. With him died her dreams of a gentle life of children and a home in Philadelphia where Robert had planned to practice law. That was 10 years ago. Now she was a frontier woman who could skin a deer, birth a calf, and shoot a man if necessary. She'd sworn never to marry, dedicating herself instead to helping her parents carve this ranch from the wilderness. The sound of hoofbeats brought Victoria to the window. Her parents weren't back yet. It was a lone rider approaching at a steady pace. She recognized the blue uniform of the Pacific Railroad Company and felt a knot form in her stomach. The railroad men had been surveying the area for months, bringing with them promises of progress and threats of change. Victoria grabbed her father's shotgun from above the door and stepped onto the porch, the weapon held casually but visibly. The rider, seeing her stance, slowed his approach. "Ma'am," he called, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for Thomas Henderson." "He's not here," Victoria replied coldly. "I'm his daughter. Whatever business you have can wait until tomorrow." The man, young, barely 30, with the refined accent of an Easterner, smiled pleasantly. "I'm afraid it can't, Miss Henderson. I have official documents from Colonel Ezra Miller, director of the Pacific Railroad Company's Wyoming Division." He extended an envelope sealed with wax. Victoria made no move to take it. "You can leave it. My father will read it when he returns." The messenger's smile tightened. "I'm instructed to deliver this personally and await a response." "Then you'll be waiting a while," Victoria said. "Coffee's on if you want some." She turned and went inside, leaving the door open, an invitation that also allowed her to keep the shotgun within reach as she returned to the table. The messenger, after a moment's hesitation, followed her inside, removing his hat. "James Miller," he introduced himself. "The Colonel's son." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "The railroad baron's boy himself. To what do we owe the honor?" "Just following orders, Miss Henderson," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. His eyes, a striking blue that seemed at odds with his otherwise serious demeanor, scanned the cabin with obvious curiosity. "You have an impressive library for a frontier home." "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married," Victoria said curtly, unwilling to engage in pleasantries with a railroad man. Everyone knew what followed the tracks: land seizures, speculation, and the destruction of the life they'd built. "And were you educated back east?" James asked. Victoria's jaw tightened. "Philadelphia. Until the war." Understanding dawned in James's eyes as he noticed the daguerreotype. "I see. I'm sorry for your loss." "Everyone lost something," Victoria replied. "That's what war does." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only when the door opened, and Thomas entered, his expression darkening at the sight of the railroad man sitting at his table. "Henderson," James said, rising to his feet. "I've brought—" I know what you've brought," Thomas interrupted, his voice like gravel. "Your father's been threatening it for months." James produced the envelope again. "Official notice of railroad right-of-way acquisition. The Pacific Line will be cutting through the eastern section of your property. The company is prepared to offer fair compensation." Thomas's laugh was harsh. "There's nothing fair about being forced off land you've bled for." He snatched the envelope but didn't open it. "Your father fought for the Confederacy, didn't he, boy?" James's posture stiffened. "Colonel Miller served the South, yes. The war's been over for 10 years. "Not out here, it hasn't," Thomas said quietly. "Out here, it's still about who has the power to take what they want." He tossed the envelope onto the table. "Tell your father I'll consider his offer when hell freezes over." James's face remained composed, but his eyes hardened. "This isn't a request, Mr. Henderson. The railroad is coming through with or without your cooperation. The territory governor has already approved the route." "Get off my land," Thomas said, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. James held his gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. "I'll tell the colonel you received the notice." He placed his hat back on his head and moved to the door, pausing to address Victoria. "Miss Henderson, it was a pleasure. I hope we can resolve this amicably." After he'd gone, Thomas slumped into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. "They're coming for the land, Vicky. Just like I said they would." Margaret entered, her face grim. She'd clearly heard everything. "How much time do we have?" Thomas tore open the envelope, scanning the legal document inside. They start surveying in a week. Construction begins in 3 months. He looked up, his eyes hollow. They're offering $200 for 5 acres of our best grazing land. That's robbery, Victoria said. That's progress, Margaret replied bitterly. What are we going to do, Thomas? Before he could answer, another horse approached. This time it was Charlotte Williams, their 18-year-old neighbor, riding bareback on her dappled mare. Her blonde hair was coming loose from its pins, and her face was flushed with exertion. Victoria hurried outside to meet her. Charlotte practically fell into her arms, trembling. "What's happened?" Victoria demanded, leading her inside. "It's Papa," Charlotte said, fighting back tears. "The railroad men came with papers. Our land has coal under it, they said. They want all of it, not just a right-of-way." Papa started drinking again. He's talking about selling everything and heading to California. Margaret guided the girl to a chair. "Where is your father now, Charlotte?" "He rode into redemption," Charlotte said miserably. "Said he was going to play cards with those railroad workers at the saloon. But we both know what happens when he gambles. He'll lose everything, just like before." Thomas and Victoria exchanged grim looks. William Harrison was a troubled man. Once a respected surgeon in St. Louis, he'd served as a Confederate medical officer during the war. Whatever horrors he'd witnessed had hollowed him out, replacing his skill and compassion with a desperate thirst for whiskey. His wife Sarah had left when Charlotte was 6, unable to bear his descent into alcoholism. Since then, he'd managed to function as a carpenter, building their small cabin and maintaining a semblance of dignity until the bottle called again. "I'll go after him," Thomas said, rising. "No," Victoria interjected. "You know how he gets when other men try to interfere. Let me go." "It's not proper for a young woman to enter a saloon," Margaret protested. Victoria's laugh was without humor. "We're 50 miles from proper, mother. Besides, I can handle William. He listens to me sometimes." Charlotte looked up hopefully. "Will you?" "Victoria? He respects you. Says you remind him of Sarah before everything went wrong." Thomas reluctantly nodded his agreement. "Take your pistol, and be back before dark." Victoria grabbed her hat and gun belt. "I'll bring him home, Charlotte. I promise." As she mounted her horse, Victoria caught sight of James Miller riding away in the distance, a cloud of dust marking his progress toward redemption. Something about his rigid posture suggested he wasn't simply delivering bad news, he was a man caught between duty and conscience. Victoria urged her horse forward, unaware that she was riding toward a confrontation that would forever alter the course of all their lives. The sun hung low over the western mountains as Victoria approached Redemption, casting long shadows across the single dusty street that constituted the town's main thoroughfare. Despite its grandiose name, Redemption was barely more than a collection of hastily constructed buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, and a handful of cabins. The recent arrival of the railroad survey team had swelled its population, bringing with it an atmosphere of restless anticipation. Victoria dismounted outside Donovan's saloon, tying her horse to the hitching post. She adjusted her gun belt, making sure the Colt was easily accessible beneath her riding coat. Women weren't common in frontier saloons, especially unaccompanied, and she had no intention of being caught unprepared. The stench of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and tobacco smoke hit her as she pushed through the bat-wing doors. Conversation stuttered to a halt as heads turned toward her. Victoria scanned the room until she spotted William Harrison hunched over a table in the back, playing cards with 4 railroad workers. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood at his elbow. "Miss Henderson," the bartender called, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. "This ain't no place for a lady." "I'm not here as a lady, Mr. Donovan," Victoria replied, her voice carrying in the suddenly quiet room. "I'm here for Dr. Harrison. His daughter's waiting for him." William looked up, his once handsome face flushed with alcohol, his eyes unfocused. At 45, he looked 20 years older, his skilled surgeon's hands now trembling as they clutched his cards. "Victoria," he slurred, "come to rescue the old drunk again." His laugh was bitter self-loathing. One of the railroad men, a burly foreman with a scar across his cheek, leered at Victoria. "Your lady friend can join us, Doc. We've got plenty of room." Victoria ignored him, walking directly to William's table. "Charlotte's worried sick. It's time to go home." William gestured expansively, spilling his whiskey. "Can't leave now. I'm about to win back everything I've lost." He leaned toward her, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They want my land, Vicky. All of it. Coal underneath, they say. Worth a fortune." "Then why are you gambling it away?" Victoria asked quietly. Pain flashed across William's face. "Because I'm a coward. Always have been. Easier to lose it at cards than watch them take it by force." He knocked back his remaining whiskey. "Besides, what does it matter? Sarah's gone. Charlotte deserves better than me. Maybe this is for the best." The scarred foreman laid down his cards. "Royal flush, Doc. Looks like your luck's run out." William stared at the cards, then emptied his pockets, pushing a handful of coins and a folded document across the table. "That's everything I have. And the deed to my land." Victoria grabbed his wrist. "William, no! You can't do this to Charlotte." The foreman reached for the deed, but Victoria was faster, snatching it away. "This isn't his to wager," she said firmly. "He's drunk and you've been plying him with whiskey. This game is over." The foreman rose slowly, towering over her. "That's not how it works out here, little lady. A man's bet is his word. And a cheat's game isn't binding," came a voice from the door. James Miller stood in the entrance, still in his railroad uniform, his expression hard as he surveyed the scene. "Mr. Miller," the foreman said suddenly, less certain, "we were just having a friendly game." "I saw nothing friendly about it," James replied, stepping fully into the saloon. "4 railroad employees taking advantage of an inebriated local landowner. My father would be very interested to hear about this unauthorized negotiation." The mention of Colonel Miller had an immediate effect. The foreman and his companions gathered their winnings, leaving the deed untouched. "No harm meant, sir," the foreman muttered. "Just passing the time." James watched them leave before turning to Victoria. "Miss Henderson, seems we keep crossing paths today." Victoria, still gripping the deed, eyed him suspiciously. "Why would you interfere? Your father wants this land." "My father wants it legally acquired," James corrected her. "Not won in a rigged card game that would never stand up to scrutiny." He glanced at William, who had slumped forward nearly unconscious. "I think Dr. Harrison needs to go home." Together, they managed to get William onto his horse. Victoria secured him with a rope to prevent him from falling off, then turned to James. "Thank you," she said reluctantly, "though I'm not sure why you helped." James's expression was unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Contrary to what you might think, Miss Henderson, not everyone associated with the railroad is a villain. Some of us actually believe in fair dealings." "Fair," Victoria echoed. "Is it fair to force people from land they've worked for years? Progress comes at a cost," James said, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. The railroad will connect this territory to the rest of the nation, bring civilization, commerce, opportunity. It will destroy a way of life, Victoria countered. James seemed about to respond when a commotion at the far end of the street caught their attention. A group of mounted men was approaching, led by a commanding figure on a black stallion. "That's my father," James said, his posture straightening involuntarily. Colonel Ezra Miller was a striking man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a black coat over a brocade waistcoat, looking more like a banker than a former military officer. But the hardness in his eyes and the way he carried himself spoke of battlefield experience and absolute authority. "James," he called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "I expected you back hours ago." "I delivered the notices as instructed, Father," James replied, his tone formal. Colonel Miller's gaze shifted to Victoria and the semi-conscious William, his lip curled slightly in disdain. "I see you've been socializing with the locals." "Dr. Harrison was being taken advantage of by some of our workers," James explained. "I intervened." "Commendable," the colonel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. His cold gray eyes assessed Victoria. "Miss Henderson, I presume your father's reputation precedes him." "A stubborn man." "A principled one," Victoria replied evenly. The colonel smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Principles are a luxury in a developing territory, Miss Henderson. Progress waits for no one." He turned back to his son. "We have matters to discuss. Now." James hesitated, glancing at Victoria. "Will you manage with Dr. Harrison?" "We'll be fine," Victoria said. "Thank you again for your assistance." As James rode away with his father, Victoria couldn't help noticing the tension between them. Colonel Miller was lecturing his son in low, urgent tones, while James's back had gone rigid with what looked like barely contained disagreement. With effort, Victoria got William back to his cabin just as night was falling. Charlotte rushed out to help her father inside her face, a mixture of relief and resignation. "Was it bad?" she asked Victoria, as they settled William on his bed. "He nearly lost the deed to your land," Victoria admitted, showing her the document. "Keep this somewhere safe. The railroad wants your property, something about coal deposits." Charlotte's blue eyes widened. "What are we going to do? Papa can't fight them when he's like this." Victoria took the girl's hands in hers. "We'll figure something out. I promise. Your father just needs time to get back on his feet." "He hasn't been on his feet since Mama left," Charlotte said bitterly. "Sometimes I think he's trying to drink himself into the grave to join her." Victoria hugged her friend tightly. "Don't say that. Your father loves you, Charlotte. He's just lost his way." As she rode home through the darkness, Victoria couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. The arrival of the railroad and Colonel Miller had upset the delicate balance of their lives. War was coming again, not with bullets and cannons this time, but with lawyers and surveyors, and men in suits making decisions in distant offices about land they'd never worked and people they'd never met. By the time she reached the Henderson ranch, it was fully dark. A lantern burned in the window, her parents waiting up, despite the late hour. Victoria unsaddled her horse and was leading it to the barn when she noticed movement in the shadows. Her hand went to her pistol. "Who's there?" "Just me, Miss Henderson." Here James Miller stepped into the pool of light from the barn lantern. "I apologize for startling you." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Why are you lurking around our property in the dark, Mr. Miller?" "I came to warn you," he said, glancing nervously toward the house. "My father has plans beyond the railroad. There's something you need to know about your father's past." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What are you talking about? During the war, James said quietly. Your father was captured at Chancellorsville, wasn't he? Victoria stiffened. For 3 months. What of it? Did he ever tell you what happened during those 3 months? James asked. What he did to secure his release. Before Victoria could respond, the door to the house opened and Thomas's voice rang out. Victoria, is that you? James stepped back into the shadows. Be careful, Miss Henderson. My father knows things he's not afraid to use. Don't let your father face him alone. With that, he disappeared into the darkness. Victoria stood frozen, her mind racing. What secrets was her father keeping? And why was the railroad baron's son warning her in the dead of night? Victoria! Thomas called again, more urgently. Coming, Pa, she answered, leading her horse into the barn. Whatever storm was brewing, it would break over all their heads soon enough. And when it did, Victoria feared that none of them would emerge unscathed. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the sagebrush surrounding the Henderson ranch. Victoria rose before sunrise, her sleep having been fitful and plagued by troubling dreams. James Miller's cryptic warning about her father's wartime past had stirred questions she'd never thought to ask. Thomas was already outside checking the fences on the eastern boundary, the section marked for the railroad's passage. Victoria watched him from the kitchen window as she helped her mother prepare breakfast. Even from a distance, she could see the stiffness in his movements, the weight of worry evident in his posture. He didn't sleep, Margaret said quietly, noticing her daughter's gaze. Paced half the night, then went out before first light. Victoria hesitated, then decided to broach the subject directly. Mother, what happened to Pa during the war when he was captured? Margaret's hands stilled over the biscuit dough. Why do you ask that now? Something James Miller said last night, about Pa's captivity. He implied there were secrets. Margaret wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, her expression guarded. The war changed your father, Victoria. Changed all of us. Some things are better left buried. Not if they're about to be dug up and used against us, Victoria pressed. If Colonel Miller knows something, your father will tell you if he thinks you need to know, Margaret interrupted firmly. Now, take him out some coffee. He'll be cold. Recognizing her mother's tone as one that brooked no argument, Victoria filled a tin mug with steaming coffee and headed outside. The crisp morning air stung her cheeks as she made her way toward her father, who was hammering a loose fence post back into place with unnecessary force. Brought you coffee, Pa, she called. Thomas straightened, massaging his lower back. At 45, the hard years of frontier life had left their mark silver, threading his dark hair, deep lines etched around his eyes. He accepted the mug with a nod of thanks. Railroad stakes, he said grimly, gesturing to a line of wooden markers with red flags that stretched across their property. They came in the night, marking their claim. Victoria surveyed the stakes with dismay. Seeing the physical evidence of the railroad's intentions made it suddenly painfully real. Can we fight it legally? Thomas laughed bitterly. The law's on their side. Government wants the railroad, the territory wants the railroad. Our rights don't factor into it. He took a long drink of coffee, then fixed his daughter with a penetrating look. Charlotte told me you ran into James Miller again last night. Victoria hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He helped me with William, and he mentioned something about your time as a prisoner during the war. Thomas went very still, his knuckles whitening around the mug. Did he now? And what exactly did the colonel's boy have to say about that? Nothing specific, just that his father knows things he might use against you. Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring out across the land he'd fought so hard to claim and cultivate. Finally, he sighed heavily. There are things I've never told you, Victoria. Things I'm not proud of. But whatever Miller thinks he knows, he can go to hell. I won't be blackmailed off my land. Pa, Victoria began, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. 5 men on horseback were coming up the trail to their ranch, Colonel Miller at their head. Beside him rode James, looking uncomfortable, and behind them were 3 armed men, not regular railroad workers, but the kind of hard-faced men who sold their guns to the highest bidder. Thomas handed Victoria his coffee mug. Go inside. Get your mother. I'm staying, Victoria said firmly, her hand moving to the revolver at her hip. Stubborn as your mother, Thomas muttered, but didn't argue further. Colonel Miller reined in his horse a respectful distance from the fence line. Henderson, he called. I see you've discovered our survey markers. I discovered your trespass, Thomas replied coldly. Your men had no right to come onto my property. Miller smiled thinly. Actually, we have every legal right. The territorial governor signed the authorization yesterday. He reached into his coat and withdrew a document extending it toward Thomas. This grants the Pacific Railroad Company immediate access for surveying purposes with construction to follow in 90 days. Thomas made no move to take the paper. Get off my land, Miller. The colonel's smile faded. I had hoped we could be reasonable about this. The railroad is offering fair compensation. $200 for 5 acres of prime grazing land isn't fair by any measure, Victoria interjected. Miller's cold gaze shifted to her. Miss Henderson, this is a business discussion between men. Perhaps you should attend to domestic matters. Victoria stiffened, but before she could retort, James spoke up. The lady has a point, Father. The initial offer is below market value for improved ranch land. Miller shot his son a look of irritation. The company's finances are not your concern, James. He turned back to Thomas. I'm authorized to increase the offer to $300. That's more than generous for this wilderness. Not interested, Thomas said flatly. Not at any price. Miller's expression hardened. Don't force my hand, Henderson. I know about Chancellorsville, about what you did there. Victoria felt her father tense beside her. Be careful, Miller, Thomas warned, his voice dangerously low. You're treading on ground you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Miller replied. I understand that a Union sergeant who collaborated with Confederate intelligence to save his own skin might not want that information becoming public knowledge, especially not in a community where half the men lost brothers and sons fighting for the North. A deadly silence fell. Victoria looked at her father in shock, but Thomas's face had gone completely blank, the same expression he wore when he pulled the trigger on his rifle. You have 1 week to accept our offer, Miller continued, apparently oblivious to the danger he was in. After that, I'll be forced to pursue other avenues of persuasion. He tipped his hat mockingly. Good day, Henderson, Miss Henderson. As Miller turned his horse, James lingered, his expression troubled. He met Victoria's gaze briefly, a silent apology in his eyes, before following his father. The moment they were out of earshot, Victoria turned to her father. Pa, what was he talking about? You never collaborated with the Confederates. Thomas's face was ashen. Go inside, Victoria. I need to think. No, she said firmly. No more secrets. If Miller's threatening you, threatening us, I deserve to know why. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then, with a deep sigh that seemed to deflate him, he gestured toward the barn. Not here. Your mother doesn't need to hear this again. Inside the dim confines of the barn, Thomas sat heavily on a bale of hay, suddenly looking every day of his 45 years and more. I was captured at Chancellorsville, he began, his voice hollow. Me and 16 other men from my unit. The Rebs took us to a holding camp near Richmond. Conditions were brutal. Men dying of dysentery starvation. I watched half my unit waste away in 2 months. He paused, staring at his hands, as if seeing them covered in something only he could perceive. There was a Confederate officer, a doctor studying battlefield wounds. He offered me a deal. Help him with his research, provide information about Union troop movements I'd seen before capture, and he'd arrange my release in a prisoner exchange. Victoria felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. What kind of research? Thomas's eyes clouded with remembered horror. The kind no decent doctor would conduct. Experiments on prisoners who were already dying. Testing how long it took different wounds to kill a man, how much blood loss was survivable, how gangrene spread through different types of injuries. My God, Victoria whispered. I refused at first, Thomas continued. Told him to go to hell. But then men from my unit started dying faster. The doctor made sure they got less food, less water, made it clear their suffering would continue unless I cooperated. He looked up at Victoria, his eyes pleading for understanding. I gave him old information, Victoria. Things the Confederate command already knew, or that wouldn't matter anymore. Basic field medicine observations. Nothing that would have changed the course of any battle. But you helped with his experiments, Victoria asked, struggling to reconcile this revelation with the father she'd known her entire life. Thomas shook his head vehemently. No, never. I drew the line there. I watched, took notes, hated myself for it, but I never laid a hand on any prisoner. And I managed to smuggle some medicine, extra food to the men when I could. His voice broke. It wasn't enough. I couldn't save them. The doctor arranged your release. Eventually, in a prisoner exchange 3 months after my capture. Thomas's expression darkened. That doctor was Ezra Miller, Colonel Miller now of the Pacific Railroad. Victoria felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Miller was the one conducting those experiments. Thomas nodded grimly. He was already a monster before the war gave him permission to indulge his worst instincts. After the surrender, he should have been tried for war crimes, but he had connections, money, reinvented himself as a businessman. And now he's here, Victoria said softly, using your past against you. He kept records, Thomas said. My signature on reports. He's threatening to expose me as a collaborator, conveniently leaving out his own role. In a territory where half the settlers lost someone to the war, that kind of accusation could be a death sentence. Victoria's mind was racing. We can fight this. Tell the truth about what he did. My word against his, a wealthy railroad baron versus a struggling rancher. Thomas laughed bitterly. Besides, there's your mother to consider. Margaret's family were staunch Union supporters. Her brother died at Gettysburg. The shame would destroy her. Mother would understand, Victoria insisted. She loves you. Some things test even the strongest love, Thomas replied quietly. I've lived with this shame for 10 years, Victoria. Built a life, tried to be a good husband, a good father. Now Miller's going to take it all away unless I give him what he wants. We won't let him, Victoria said fiercely. There has to be evidence of what he did. Other survivors. Thomas shook his head. Most died in that camp. The few who survived scattered after the war, trying to forget. He rose wearily. Don't tell your mother we discussed this. Let me figure out how to break it to her myself. As he walked back toward the house, shoulders bowed under the weight of his revelation, Victoria remained in the barn. her mind churning with this new, terrible knowledge. The Thomas Henderson she knew was a hard man, but a just one. To imagine him forced into collaboration watching atrocities he was powerless to stop it, made Miller's casual cruelty all the more monstrous. One thing was certain, she would not stand by while Miller destroyed her family with his threats. There had to be a way to fight back, to expose the true villain in this story. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. Victoria emerged from the barn to see Charlotte Williams riding hard toward the ranch, her face streaked with tears. "Victoria!" she cried, practically falling from her horse. "You have to come quickly. It's Papa. He's gone mad." Victoria urged her horse faster, Charlotte clinging to her waist as they galloped toward the Williams cabin. The morning sun was now high overhead, its brightness a stark contrast to the darkness of the day's revelations. "He started drinking at dawn," Charlotte explained breathlessly. "Then those railroad men came back, said Papa had wagered our land last night and lost. He went crazy, Victoria. Got his old service revolver. Said he'd shoot anyone who tried to take our home." Victoria's heart sank. William Harrison was dangerous enough sober. Drunk and armed, he was liable to get himself killed or worse, kill someone else, and end up at the end of a rope. "Where was he when you left?" "On the porch with the gun," Charlotte sobbed. "The railroad men backed off, but they said they were getting the marshal from town." As they crested the hill overlooking the Williams property, Victoria slowed her horse. The small cabin sat in a clearing beside a stream smoke rising from its chimney. William was indeed on the porch, rifle in hand, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. 6 mounted men waited at a safe distance, including the scarred foreman from the saloon. Victoria dismounted, helping Charlotte down. "Stay here," she instructed. "If there's shooting, get to those rocks and take cover." "Don't let them hurt him," Charlotte pleaded. "He's not well." Victoria approached cautiously, her hands visible to show she wasn't reaching for her weapon. "William," she called. "It's Victoria Henderson." Harrison whirled, rifle raised, then lowered it slightly when he recognized her. His face was flushed with alcohol and rage, his eyes wild. "Victoria," he slurred. "Come to witness my last stand. These vultures think they can take my Sarah's home." He gestured violently with the rifle toward the railroad men. "No one's taking anything today," Victoria said calmly, continuing her approach. "Let's talk about this." The scarred foreman spat on the ground. "Nothing to talk about. He bet the deed last night fair and square." "He was drunk," Victoria countered without taking her eyes off William. "And you kept filling his glass. No judge would uphold such a wager." "No judges out here," the foreman replied. "Just men settling their debts. Or dying with them." William laughed, a brittle, desperate sound. "See, they want me to die, Victoria. Maybe I should. Maybe that's the answer." Victoria had reached the bottom of the porch steps now. "That's not the answer, William. Think of Charlotte." Pain flashed across his haggard face. "Charlotte deserves better than a drunken failure for a father. Sarah knew it. That's why she left." "Sarah didn't leave," came a new voice. James Miller rode into the clearing alone, his blue uniform a stark contrast to the dusty clothes of the railroad workers. He dismounted and walked forward, ignoring the tension crackling in the air. "What did you say?" William demanded, the rifle now trained on James. "Sarah Harrison didn't leave you," James repeated, stopping beside Victoria. "At least not voluntarily." William's hands began to shake. "What do you know about my wife?" James's expression was grim. I know my father had her removed when she discovered what he'd done during the war. The same experiments he's threatening to expose Thomas Henderson for witnessing." A deathly silence fell. Victoria stared at James in shock, unable to believe he was betraying his father so openly. "Sarah was a nurse in the Confederate Medical Corps," James continued. "She assisted my father unaware of what he was really doing. When she found out, she threatened to report him to the authorities. He arranged for her to disappear, made it look like she'd abandoned you and Charlotte." William lowered the rifle slightly, his face ashen. "Sarah wouldn't. She loved Charlotte. She wouldn't leave her child." "She didn't have a choice," James said quietly. "My father gave her an ultimatum: disappear, or he'd ensure both you and Charlotte met with accidents. She left to protect you." Victoria found her voice. "How do you know all this?" James's eyes were pained. "I found her letters. She wrote to my father for years begging to be allowed to contact you. He kept them all some kind of twisted trophy." William staggered, nearly dropping his rifle. Victoria rushed up the steps to steady him gently, taking the weapon from his unresisting hands. "Is she—" William couldn't finish the question. "I don't know," James admitted. "The letters stopped 3 years ago. My father may know, but he never speaks of her." The scarred foreman had heard enough. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that Harrison owes us a deed." "Actually, it does," James countered, his voice hardening. "As a senior representative of the Pacific Railroad Company, I'm nullifying any gambling debts incurred by Dr. Harrison. Furthermore, I'm initiating a full review of all land acquisitions in this area." He fixed the foreman with a steely gaze. "Unless you'd prefer I start with an investigation into how company employees are extorting local landowners through rigged card games." The foreman's face darkened with anger, but he clearly recognized the authority in James's voice. "Colonel Miller will hear about this." "I'm counting on it," James replied evenly. After a tense moment, the railroad men turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. William slumped onto a porch chair, his face in his hands. "Sarah didn't abandon us," he whispered, his voice breaking. "All these years I thought—" Charlotte emerged from hiding and ran to her father, embracing him as he wept openly. Victoria stepped back, giving them privacy in their grief and shock. James approached her, his expression troubled. "I've just made an enemy of my father," he said quietly. "He won't take this betrayal lightly." "Why did you do it?" Victoria asked. "Why turn against your own father?" James's blue eyes were haunted. "Because I've spent years trying to ignore what he is, making excuses, telling myself the war changed him, that the man who raised me couldn't be the monster others described." He shook his head. "But I've seen the evidence, the letters, the records he keeps. He's exactly what they say he is, and I can't be part of it anymore." Victoria studied him, reassessing everything she'd assumed about the railroad baron's son. "What will you do now?" "Try to undo some of the damage he's caused," James replied. "Starting with your father. There are records proof of what really happened at that prison camp. Journals my father kept documenting everything." His voice lowered. "Including the fact that Thomas Henderson sabotaged several of the experiments, saving lives at great risk to himself." Hope flared in Victoria's chest. "Those records could clear my father's name." "They could also destroy my father," James said grimly. "Which is why he keeps them locked in his private safe at railroad headquarters in Redemption." Victoria's mind was already racing with possibilities. "We need those records." "It won't be easy," James warned. "The office is guarded day and night. The safe requires a key my father keeps with him at all times. and once he realizes I've turned against him, I won't have access to the building." "Then we need to act quickly," Victoria said, "before he discovers what you've done here today." James hesitated. "This is dangerous, Miss Henderson. My father isn't above violence when he feels threatened." "Neither am I," Victoria replied, her hand resting on her revolver. "And I won't stand by while he destroys my family with lies." Their planning was interrupted by William, who approached them with Charlotte at his side. The doctor looked years older, but there was a clarity in his eyes that alcohol had long obscured. "Mr. Miller," he said formally, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You've given me back my wife's honor, if not her presence." James looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I only told the truth, Dr. Harrison." "Nevertheless," William insisted, "if there's ever anything I can do to help you, you need only ask." Victoria saw an opportunity. "Actually, there might be," she said. "We need to get into your father's office. Dr. Harrison, you were a surgeon. How are your lock-picking skills?" William blinked in surprise. Then a ghost of his old confidence crossed his face. "Steady hands were my specialty, Miss Henderson. I may be a drunk, but I still remember how to use the tools of my trade." "Good," Victoria said decisively, "because we're going to break into the railroad office tonight and steal the evidence that can stop Colonel Miller once and for all." Charlotte gasped. "Victoria, that's madness. If you're caught, if we do nothing, your father loses his land, my father loses his reputation, and Miller continues destroying lives," Victoria interrupted. "Sometimes madness is the only sane response." James looked at each of them in turn, his expression a mixture of doubt and determination. "If we're really doing this, we need a plan. The night watchman makes his rounds every half hour. The safe is in my father's private office on the second floor, and the colonel often works late." "Then we'll need a distraction," Victoria said. "Something to ensure your father isn't in his office tonight." William straightened, a spark of his former self visible beneath the damage of years of self-destruction. "Leave that to me. I believe I have a gambling debt to settle with some railroad men tonight. Should keep them busy for a few hours." "You can't go back to drinking," Charlotte protested. William took his daughter's hands. "One night of pretend, Charlotte, to make amends for all the nights that weren't." He turned to Victoria and James. "While I create a scene at the saloon, you can access the office. I'll make sure word reaches the colonel that I'm causing trouble." Victoria nodded. "We'll meet at the old mining shed by Rattlesnake Creek at sunset to finalize the details." She turned to James. "Can you get a copy of the office keys?" "I have my own set," he confirmed. "Father insisted I maintain regular hours at headquarters." A wry smile touched his lips. "He's very particular about punctuality." As they prepared to depart, Victoria pulled James aside. "Why are you really doing this? Betraying your father, risking everything. It can't just be conscience." James was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "When I was 12, my mother killed herself. The official story was that she'd been unwell depressed. But I found her journal afterward. She knew what my father had done during the war. The experiments, the deaths. She couldn't live with being married to such a man." His voice hardened. "I've spent 15 years trying to convince myself she was wrong about him. I can't do it anymore." Victoria felt a surge of empathy for the man she'd so quickly judged. "I'm sorry about your mother." "So am I," James replied softly. "But perhaps, tonight, we can finally give her justice and Sarah Harrison and all the others my father has harmed." As Victoria mounted her horse for the ride back to the Henderson ranch, She was acutely aware that they were crossing a threshold. After tonight, there would be no turning back. They would either succeed in exposing Miller's crimes or face consequences she didn't want to contemplate. The sun was beginning its westward descent, casting long shadows across the Wyoming landscape. In a few hours, they would attempt to break into one of the most secure buildings in Redemption, steal evidence against one of the most powerful men in the territory, and change the course of all their lives. Victoria only hoped they wouldn't be changing those lives for the worse. When she arrived home, she found Thomas sitting on the porch, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. The set of his jaw told her he'd made a decision. "I'm taking the railroad's offer," he said without preamble. $300 and we'll relocate, maybe Idaho. I hear there's good land there." Victoria sat beside him, choosing her words carefully. "I know about Sarah Harrison, about what really happened in that prison camp." Thomas's hands stilled on the rifle. "Who told you?" "James Miller. He's turned against his father. He knows the truth, that you tried to help those prisoners, that you sabotaged Miller's experiments." She took a deep breath. "There are records, Pa, proof that could clear your name and expose Miller for what he really is." Hope and fear warred in Thomas's weathered face. "What kind of proof?" "Miller's own journals, detailed records of everything he did, including your attempts to interfere." Victoria leaned forward intently. "We're going to get those records tonight. James William Harrison and I." Thomas set the rifle down with deliberate care. "Absolutely not. Breaking into Miller's office. That's not just dangerous, Victoria, it's suicidal. Miller has armed guards. If you're caught, the best you can hope for is prison." "And if we do nothing, we lose everything," Victoria countered. "Our land, your reputation, maybe even more. Miller isn't going to stop with $300 and 5 acres. He wants all of it." "This isn't your battle to fight," Thomas insisted. "It became my battle when Miller threatened my family," Victoria replied, her voice firm. "I'm not asking your permission, Pa. I'm telling you what's going to happen." Thomas stared at his daughter, recognizing the same stubborn determination that had gotten him through the war, through the hard years of building their ranch from nothing. It was like looking in a mirror. "Your mother can never know about this," he finally said. "It would worry her sick." Victoria nodded, understanding that this was as close to approval as she would get. "We're meeting at the old mining shed at sunset to plan. Will you come?" Thomas picked up his rifle again, checking the action. "Someone has to make sure you don't get yourselves killed." As the afternoon waned, Victoria prepared for the evening's mission, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. She changed into dark clothing, strapped on her revolver, and tucked a knife into her boot. Whatever happened tonight, she would be ready. She was about to leave when Margaret entered her room carrying a small leather pouch. "You're going out?" her mother asked, noting Victoria's attire. "Just meeting Charlotte." Victoria lied, hating the deception, but knowing it was necessary. Her father's had a rough day. Margaret studied her daughter's face, her eyes knowing. "You've never been able to lie to me, Victoria. Not since you were small." She held out the leather pouch. "Take this. It was my father's. He carried it through the War of 1812. Victoria opened the pouch to find a small Derringer pistol, no larger than her palm. "Mother, a woman should always have options," Margaret said simply. "Whatever you and your father are planning, be careful. Miller isn't just ruthless, he's cunning." Stunned by her mother's perception, Victoria embraced her tightly. "How did you know?" "I've been married to your father for 26 years, Margaret replied with a sad smile. "I know when he's preparing for battle." She stepped back, her expression serious. "Promise me you'll come home, Victoria. both of you." "I promise," Victoria said, tucking the derringer into her bodice. As she rode toward the meeting place, the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold across the western mountains. It looked like blood on the horizon, an omen Victoria tried to ignore, as she urged her horse faster. The old mining shed loomed ahead, abandoned years ago when the small copper vein played out. Thomas was already there, deep in conversation with James Miller and William Harrison. Charlotte sat nearby, her face a mask of worry. "Everyone's here," Victoria observed as she dismounted. "Good, we don't have much time." James unrolled a rough sketch of the railroad headquarters on a barrel top. "The safe is here in my father's private office. The night watchman patrols every 30 minutes following this route." He traced a path with his finger. "We'll have approximately 20 minutes once we're inside before he returns to this section." "What about other guards?" Thomas asked, studying the layout. "Two men at the main entrance, usually playing cards by this time of night," James replied. "They don't patrol, just monitor who comes and goes." William pointed to a rear window on the sketch. "Is this accessible?" "It opens onto the back alley," James confirmed. "It's usually locked, but it's an old building. The locks aren't sophisticated." "That's my way in," William said, with a confidence that seemed to surprise even him. "Once inside, I can open the side door for the rest of you." They spent the next hour refining their plan. William would create a distraction at the saloon, ensuring that Colonel Miller was called away from his office. Meanwhile, William would break in through the rear window and admit Victoria, Thomas, and James through a side entrance. They would have 20 minutes to crack the safe, retrieve the documents, and escape before the night watchman returned. As darkness fell completely, they prepared to move out. Charlotte hugged her father tightly. "Please be careful," she whispered. "I will, sweetheart," William promised. "For once in my life, I'm doing something worthy of your mother's memory." They rode toward redemption in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Victoria couldn't help wondering if they were being reckless, risking everything on this desperate gamble. But the alternative, surrender to Miller's blackmail and threats, was unthinkable. The lights of the small settlement appeared ahead, a scattered constellation in the vast darkness of the Wyoming night. Somewhere in that collection of buildings was the evidence they needed to stop Colonel Miller. And somewhere, too, was the man himself, a monster, masquerading as a pillar of progress and civilization. Tonight, they would expose him for what he truly was, or die in the attempt. Redemption at night was a different world from its daytime facade. Oil lamps cast yellow pools of light along the main street, illuminating saloons where piano music mingled with raucous laughter. The railroad headquarters, a two-story structure of imposing red brick, stood dark and silent at the far end of the street, its windows reflecting the distant pinpricks of saloon lights. Victoria, Thomas, and James tethered their horses in a grove of cottonwoods behind the livery stable, while William headed directly to Donovan's saloon to begin his part of the plan. "Once we're inside, we move quickly and quietly," Thomas instructed, checking his revolver one final time. "No heroics. If we're discovered, we retreat immediately." James nodded grimly. "My father keeps the journals in a lockbox inside the safe. They're bound in red leather. You can't miss them." "How much time before William creates his distraction?" Victoria asked, securing her hair beneath a dark cap. "He'll wait 30 minutes, James replied. "That should give us time to get into position." They moved through the shadows of the back alleys, avoiding the pools of lamplight and the occasional late-night pedestrian. The railroad headquarters loomed before them, its brick facade somehow menacing in the darkness. Two guards stood at the front entrance, smoking and talking in low voices. "Around the back," James whispered, leading them through a narrow passage between buildings. The rear of the headquarters faced an unkempt alley strewn with discarded crates and barrels. A single window, approximately 7 feet from the ground, was their target. Below it, William Harrison waited, his face set in determined concentration. "You're early," he murmured as they approached. "Fewer people on the streets than we expected," Thomas explained. "Any sign of the watchman?" William shook his head. "He passed by inside about 10 minutes ago. Should be on the far side of the building now." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather case, which he unfolded to reveal a set of slender metal tools, the delicate instruments of his former surgical profession now repurposed for burglary. "Need a boost?" Thomas asked, eyeing the window's height. William nodded, and Thomas interlaced his fingers to create a step. With surprising agility for a man who'd spent years drowning in whiskey, William placed his foot in Thomas's hands and rose to the level of the window. Using one of his tools, he expertly manipulated the latch. "Still got steady hands," he murmured mostly to himself as the window swung open with barely a creak. He pulled himself up and through the opening, disappearing into the darkness of the building. Minutes passed in tense silence. Victoria found herself holding her breath, straining to hear any sound from within that might indicate William had been discovered. James paced nervously, checking his pocket watch every few seconds. "He should have reached the side door by now," he whispered. As if in response to his concern, a soft click came from a narrow door a few yards away. It opened slightly, and William's face appeared in the gap. "All clear," he whispered. "But hurry. The watchman will be back this way soon." They slipped inside, finding themselves in a narrow corridor lined with filing cabinets. The air smelled of paper ink and cigar smoke. James took the lead, guiding them toward a staircase at the end of the hall. "Father's office is on the second floor," he explained in a hushed voice. "Corner room with the best view of the street." They ascended the stairs, carefully freezing at every creak of the wooden steps. The upper floor was darker than the lower, with only a faint glow from the street lamps outside illuminating their path. James led them to an imposing oak door with a brass nameplate, "Colonel Ezra Miller, Director." The door was locked, but William made short work of it with his surgical tools. Inside Colonel Miller's office reflected the man himself, meticulously organized, imposing and coldly elegant. A massive desk dominated the space, behind which stood a large herring and combi safe. "There it is," James said, pointing to the safe. "The journals are inside." William approached the safe, studying it with professional interest. This is going to take time," he warned. "It's a good model. 6-tumbler combination lock." "How much time?" Thomas asked tensely. William shrugged. 15 minutes if I'm lucky. Longer if not." "We may not have that long," Victoria said, moving to the window that overlooked the main street. From this vantage point, she could see Donovan's saloon, where William was supposed to be creating his distraction by now. "He needs to get started," she murmured, glancing at her father's pocket watch. "The colonel could return any—" Her words died in her throat as she spotted a familiar figure striding purposefully down the boardwalk, Colonel Ezra Miller himself, heading directly toward the railroad headquarters. "He's coming," she hissed, turning from the window. "Miller's on his way here now." James went pale. "That's impossible. He should be at his private residence. William hasn't even begun the distraction." "Well, something's changed," Thomas said grimly, drawing his revolver. "We need to leave. Now." William looked up from the safe, his face lined with frustration. "Give me 5 more minutes. I've almost got it." "We don't have 5 minutes," Victoria insisted, her pulse racing. "He'll be through the front door in less than 1. A tense silence fell as they all recognized the impossible choice before them: abandon their mission or risk confrontation with Miller and his guards. "Wait," James said suddenly, moving to his father's desk. "There might be another way." He rifled through the drawers until he found a small brass key. "Father keeps a duplicate key to the safe. He thinks I don't know about it, but I've seen him use it when he's in a hurry." He hurried to a painting on the wall, a grim battlefield scene from the Civil War, and swung it aside to reveal a small hidden compartment. Inside was a second key, which he grabbed triumphantly. "Stand back," he ordered, approaching the safe. He inserted the key into a nearly invisible keyhole beneath the dial, turned it firmly, and pulled the safe door open. Inside, among stacks of documents and bags of gold coins, sat a row of red leather-bound journals. "Those are them," James confirmed, reaching for the volumes. Victoria grabbed as many as she could carry, stuffing them inside her coat. Thomas and James did the same with the remaining journals. "What about William's distraction?" Thomas asked as they prepared to leave. "If Miller comes in here and finds the safe open, I'll handle it," James decided. "The rest of you get out through the side door. I'll lock up and meet my father in the lobby. Tell him I was working late." "He'll know someone took the journals," Victoria protested. "Not if he doesn't check the safe tonight," James countered. "It might buy us a few hours at least." Footsteps echoed in the stairwell Miller was ascending. "Go," James urged them. "I'll meet you at the rendezvous point when I can." Victoria hesitated, reluctant to leave him to face his father alone, but Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a door at the back of the office that led to a private corridor. "He's right," Thomas whispered. "He's the only one who can explain his presence here, legitimately." With one last glance at James, Victoria allowed herself to be led away. William followed carefully, pulling the door closed behind them. They moved swiftly down the back corridor toward the servants' stairs, the stolen journals heavy against Victoria's ribs. They had just reached the bottom of the stairs when a shout echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Victoria froze. "James!" "We can't help him," Thomas said firmly, though his expression was pained. "Not now. We need to get these journals to safety." They slipped out through the side door into the alley, keeping to the shadows as they hurried toward their horses. Behind them, lights were coming on in the railroad headquarters, and men's voices called out in alarm. "Something's gone wrong," William muttered as they reached the cottonwood grove. "They shouldn't have discovered the theft this quickly." Victoria swung into her saddle, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. "We stick to the plan. Meet at the abandoned mine." Thomas nodded grimly. "Ride hard and don't look back. If we're separated, keep the journals safe at all costs." They spurred their horses out of town by different routes, hoping to confuse any pursuit. Victoria took the south trail, pushing her mare to a gallop once they cleared the last buildings of Redemption. The stolen journals pressed against her body, their weight a constant reminder of what they'd risked and what they might have lost. James. Had that gunshot been meant for him? Had Miller discovered his son's betrayal? The questions tormented her as she rode through the moonlit landscape, constantly glancing over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. It took nearly an hour to reach the abandoned copper mine that served as their rendezvous point. The weathered wooden structures stood like skeletons against the night sky, silent witnesses to the boom-and-bust cycle of frontier fortunes. Thomas was already there, pacing anxiously outside the main shed. His face flooded with relief when he saw Victoria approaching. "Thank God," he said, helping her dismount. "Any sign of trouble?" She shook her head. "No pursuit that I could see." "Nothing," Thomas confirmed. "But no sign of Harrison or James Miller either." Victoria's stomach tightened. "We should wait. Give them time." They secured the horses inside the dilapidated mine office and laid out the journals on a dusty table. In the yellow light of a single lantern, the red leather volumes looked almost like pools of blood. 6 journals, Thomas counted, dating from 1863 to 1865, the entire period of Miller's research. Victoria opened the earliest volume with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailed notes of procedures performed on prisoners complete with clinical observations and sketches. It was a document of calculated atrocity written with the dispassionate eye of a man who viewed human suffering as merely scientific data. "My God," she whispered, turning pages with growing horror. "He recorded everything! Names, dates, methods." Thomas was examining a later volume. "Here," he said, his voice tight. "April 1864. That's when I was brought to the camp." He read aloud, "New subject acquired. Union Sergeant Thomas Henderson, 42nd Pennsylvania. Potentially useful as assistant due to basic field medical knowledge. Will test compliance level." Victoria moved to her father's side, reading over his shoulder as he turned the pages. The entries chronicled Miller's attempts to break Thomas's will, the escalating threats against his fellow prisoners, and finally, Thomas's reluctant agreement to assist, but with constant mentions of his disappointing reluctance and sabotage of valuable research. "He knew," Thomas said, his voice a mixture of wonder and vindication. "He knew I was undermining him whenever I could." Victoria found an entry from June 1864. Henderson again administered excessive morphine to subject 12, claiming dosage error. Subject expired before procedure could be completed. Henderson's incompetence is becoming suspicious. Must consider termination once knowledge is extracted. "You were saving them," Victoria said softly, "giving them merciful deaths instead of torture." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Not all of them. Not enough." The sound of approaching hooves interrupted their grim reading. They doused the lantern immediately, Thomas drawing his revolver as they moved to defensive positions. "It's William," Victoria whispered, recognizing the rider's outline in the moonlight. Thomas lowered his weapon as William dismounted and staggered toward them, his face ashen in the dim light. "What happened?" Victoria demanded. "Where's James?" William shook his head, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Miller shot him, his own son." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "Is he—" "Alive, last I saw," William replied grimly, "but wounded badly. Shoulder or chest, couldn't tell exactly. Miller was shouting about treason betrayal. The whole town heard it." "We need to go back," Victoria said immediately. "We can't leave him." "It's too late," William countered. "Miller's got the whole company out looking for us, offering $500 for anyone who brings in the thieves who robbed the railroad office. They're forming search parties as we speak." Thomas cursed under his breath. "They'll check your cabin first, Harrison, then our ranch. We need to move these journals somewhere safe." "What about Charlotte?" William asked, his voice cracking. "If they go to my cabin." "She's smart," Victoria assured him. "She'll hide when she hears riders coming." William didn't look convinced. "I need to get to her. She's alone out there." "We'll all go," Thomas decided. "Harrison's cabin first to get Charlotte, then to our ranch for supplies. After that, we need to get these journals to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. He's the only one with authority to arrest someone like Miller." "Cheyenne's 3 days' hard ride," Victoria pointed out. "Miller will have men watching all the trails." "Then we don't take the trails," Thomas replied grimly. "We go cross-country through the high country. It'll be harder going, but they won't expect it." As they gathered the journals and prepared to depart, Victoria couldn't shake the image of James Miller facing his father's wrath and his father's bullet. He had sacrificed himself to give them a chance, and they couldn't waste it. The ride to Harrison's cabin was tense, each of them scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. They approached cautiously, relieved to find no indication that Miller's men had arrived yet. William called softly as they neared the cabin. "Charlotte, it's me." There was no response. The cabin stood dark and silent in the moonlight. "She might be hiding," Victoria suggested, but a sense of foreboding had already settled in her stomach. William lit a lantern inside, revealing a cabin in disarray. Chairs overturned, a broken plate on the floor. There was a struggle, Thomas observed grimly, examining a dark stain on the floorboards. Blood. William's face went deathly pale. "Charlotte," he called more urgently, searching the small cabin with increasing desperation. "Charlotte." Victoria found a scrap of paper pinned to the wall with a hunting knife. She pulled it free, holding it to the lantern light. "Harrison," she read aloud, "your daughter is safe for now. Bring what you stole to the railroad office by dawn, or she joins her mother. Miller." William let out an anguished cry, sinking to his knees. "No, not Charlotte. Please, God, not my little girl." Thomas took the note, his expression hardening. "He's using her as bait. Knows we'll come for her." "And we will," Victoria said firmly. "We're not abandoning Charlotte." "It's a trap," Thomas warned. "Miller will have men waiting." "I don't care," William said, rising with newfound resolve. "That's my daughter. I've failed her enough in this life. I won't fail her now." Victoria's mind was racing, trying to formulate a plan. "We need leverage," she said finally. "Something Miller wants more than the journals." "What could possibly be more valuable to him than evidence of his war crimes?" Thomas asked skeptically. Victoria's gaze fell on the floorboards where Charlotte had mentioned her mother had hidden something years ago. "William," she said slowly, "you said Sarah discovered what Miller was doing during the war. What exactly did she find?" William blinked, momentarily confused by the question. "I don't know exactly. She never told me, just said it was something terrible, something that could destroy him. And she hid it here in this cabin." William nodded. "She said she'd hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere only I would know to look if anything happened to her." His expression clouded. "But she never got the chance to tell me where." Victoria knelt beside the bloodstain on the floor, running her fingers along the worn planks. "If you were Sarah, where would you hide something precious? Something only your husband would find." William joined her, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Sarah was sentimental. She'd choose somewhere meaningful to us both." His eyes suddenly widened. "Our wedding night. We carved our initials under the bed frame." He moved to the small bed in the corner, pushing it aside with newfound strength. There, carved into the underside of the frame, were the initials WH plus SH and a small heart. "Look for anything unusual around the carving," Victoria urged. William examined the frame carefully, his surgeon's fingers probing the wood. After a moment, he found a small, nearly invisible seam. Pressing firmly, a hidden compartment opened, revealing a sealed envelope and a small leather pouch. With trembling hands, William withdrew the items. The envelope bore his name in elegant, feminine handwriting. He broke the seal and began to read, tears streaming down his face, as he finally heard from the wife he'd thought had abandoned him. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew Miller would come after her eventually. Says she discovered evidence that he wasn't just experimenting on your Union prisoners, he was selling information to both sides, prolonging the war for profit." He looked up, his expression a mixture of grief and fury. "She says Miller personally executed Confederate soldiers who discovered his treason." "A double traitor," Thomas said grimly, "betraying both North and South." William opened the leather pouch, emptying its contents onto the floor. Inside was a gold pocket watch, ornately engraved with the Confederate seal, and several folded documents bearing official Confederate Army letterhead. "Orders," William explained, examining the papers, "signed by General Lee himself, authorizing an investigation into Miller's activities. And here a letter from a Confederate colonel documenting Miller's sale of intelligence to Union forces." He shook his head in disbelief. Miller wasn't just a sadist. He was selling secrets to both sides, making money from the blood of his own men. Victoria understood immediately the value of what they'd found. This is what we need. Proof that he betrayed the Confederacy itself. Even his railroad backers wouldn't stand behind a proven traitor to the South. Thomas nodded slowly. "We can use this to trade for Charlotte. Miller would kill to keep this quiet." "But we'll need help," Victoria said, thinking aloud. "Someone Miller won't expect." Her mind turned to the wounded man who'd already risked everything to help them. James. If he's still alive, he knows his father's weaknesses better than anyone. "How do we even know if he survived?" William asked. "There's only one doctor in redemption," Victoria replied. "If James is alive, that's where he'll be." Thomas looked skeptical. "Getting into town unnoticed won't be easy. Miller will have men watching every approach." "I'll go," Victoria decided. "Alone. They'll be looking for all of us together, not a single rider." "Absolutely not," Thomas protested. "It's too dangerous." "We don't have a choice, Pa," Victoria insisted. "William needs to stay hidden. He's the only one who can verify these documents are real. You need to protect the journals. I'm the only one who can move freely without raising immediate suspicion." After fierce debate, Thomas reluctantly agreed to Victoria's plan. She would ride into Redemption under cover of darkness, locate James if he still lived, and gather whatever allies they could find. Meanwhile, Thomas and William would secure the journals and prepare for a possible confrontation with Miller. As Victoria prepared to depart, Thomas pulled her aside. "If anything happens to you—" "It won't," she interrupted firmly. "I'll be careful." Thomas pressed something into her hand, a small, tarnished silver star. "My sergeant's badge from the war. Kept it as a reminder of what I survived." His weathered face was solemn in the lantern light. "Come back to us, Victoria." She tucked the badge into her pocket, touched by the gesture. "I will, I promise." As she mounted her horse, William approached, still clutching his wife's letter. "Tell James. Tell him I understand now why Sarah trusted him. Why she wrote to him all those years. She saw something good in him, something worth saving." Victoria nodded, touched by the man's transformation from broken alcoholic to determined father in the space of a single night. "I'll tell him, and we'll get Charlotte back. That's a promise." She rode out into the darkness, the weight of their hopes heavy on her shoulders. Redemption lay 10 miles to the east, a journey that would take her through open country where Miller's men might be patrolling. But she had no choice. Charlotte's life hung in the balance, and time was running out. As she urged her horse toward town, Victoria's mind turned to James Miller. Had he survived his father's bullet? And if he had, would he still be willing to stand against the man who'd raised him? Everything depended on finding answers to those questions before dawn broke over the Wyoming territory. The moon slid behind clouds as Victoria approached Redemption from the south, using a dry creek bed to mask her approach. The town was unusually active for the late hour, with lanterns and torches visible along the main street. Miller had clearly roused the settlement in his hunt for the stolen journals. She left her horse tethered in a copse of trees at the edge of town and proceeded on foot, keeping to the shadows. Dr. Abernathy's small medical office was located behind the general store, its single window glowing with lamplight despite the hour, a promising sign that the doctor was attending to a patient. Victoria approached cautiously, avoiding the main thoroughfare where Miller's men were gathered in groups questioning townsfolk and organizing search parties. She circled behind the buildings, counting on the darkness and her dark clothing to conceal her movements. When she reached the doctor's back door, she hesitated, listening for voices within. She could hear the low murmur of conversation, at least two people speaking in hushed tones. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly. The voices instantly ceased. Footsteps approached, and the door opened a crack, revealing Dr. Abernathy's aged face, creased with exhaustion and weariness. "Who is it?" he demanded. "I'm with a patient." "I need to see him," Victoria whispered. "James Miller, please." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "You're the Henderson girl." He glanced over his shoulder nervously. "Do you know what's happening out there? Colonel Miller's offering a small fortune for your capture." "I know," Victoria said urgently. "But this is about more than money. Lives are at stake. Please, I need to see James." Abernathy hesitated, then reluctantly opened the door wider. 5 minutes, that's all. He shouldn't even be conscious, let alone receiving visitors. Victoria slipped inside her eyes, adjusting to the lamplight. The doctor's surgery was sparse but clean, with medicinal scents hanging heavy in the air. On a narrow bed against the far wall lay James Miller, his face ashen, a thick bandage visible beneath his partially unbuttoned shirt. "Victoria," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You shouldn't be here." She moved quickly to his side, kneeling beside the bed. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," James replied, with a ghost of a smile. "Father was always an excellent shot. Bullet missed my heart by an inch, according to the good doctor." "He thinks you're a traitor," Victoria said softly. James's eyes, though glazed with pain, remained sharp. "I am a traitor to him, but not to what's right." He struggled to sit up slightly. "Did you get the journals?" Victoria nodded. "All of them. And something more. Sarah Harrison's evidence that your father sold secrets to both sides during the war." James's eyebrows rose in surprise. So that's what she had. Father was always paranoid about her, even years after she disappeared. His expression darkened. "Now he's taken Charlotte Harrison, using her to force us to return everything." We know," Victoria said grimly. "That's why I'm here. We need your help, James. You know your father better than anyone. How do we get Charlotte back safely?" James was silent for a moment, his breathing labored. "My father is a calculating man," he finally said. "He never makes a move without considering all possibilities. But he has one weakness: his reputation. Everything he's built since the war depends on burying his past. So we threaten to expose him publicly." "Not just threaten," James corrected. "You need to actually begin the process. Let him see it happening." His eyes gleamed with sudden inspiration. "The newspaper office. Perkins owns the Redemption Gazette. He's always resented my father's influence. If you convince him to set the type for a story exposing father's war crimes with proof that it's going to press at dawn, Father will have to act." "He might just kill Charlotte and flee," Victoria worried. James shook his head, then winced at the movement. "No, that's not his way. He'll want to control the situation completely before he makes any irreversible moves. If he thinks there's still a chance to contain the story, he'll keep Charlotte alive as leverage." "So we create a very public standoff," Victoria mused. "Force him to negotiate in the open, where he can't simply eliminate witnesses." Exactly, James confirmed. And there's one more thing. My father keeps a private rail car at the siding east of town. It's always prepared for immediate departure, his contingency plan, if things ever go wrong. That's where he'll take Charlotte when he feels cornered. Victoria absorbed this information, formulating a plan. "Can you travel?" she asked, eyeing his wound dubiously. "Not far," James admitted. "But I can make it to the newspaper office if you help me." "You should be resting," Dr. Abernathy interjected, having listened to their conversation with growing concern. "That wound could reopen with any exertion." "I'll rest when Charlotte is safe," James said firmly. "And when my father answers for his crimes." Victoria helped James sit up, fully supporting him as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed. "We'll need to move quickly," she said. "Dawn is only a few hours away." As James struggled to stand, leaning heavily on Victoria, the back door suddenly burst open. Victoria's hand flew to her revolver, but she relaxed when she saw Thomas Henderson standing in the doorway, his expression grim. "Pa," she exclaimed, "what are you doing here? You were supposed to stay with William and the journals." "Change of plans," Thomas said tersely. "Miller's men found Harrison's cabin. They know we have Sarah's evidence." He looked at James, assessing his condition with a soldier's eye. "Can he ride?" "Not without reopening that wound," Dr. Abernathy protested. "Doesn't matter," James said, his voice stronger with determination. "What happened to William?" Thomas's face darkened. "He went after them alone, trying to trade himself for Charlotte." "And the journals?" Victoria asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "Safe, hidden." Thomas wouldn't elaborate further. "But without William to authenticate Sarah's documents, we've lost our strongest bargaining chip." James straightened despite his pain. "Not necessarily. I can authenticate them. I've seen Sarah's handwriting in the letters she sent my father. And I know enough about Confederate military correspondence to verify those documents." "Then we stick with the plan," Victoria decided. "The newspaper office. Force Miller into the open." Thomas nodded his agreement. "I passed by the railroad office on my way here. Charlotte and William are both being held there. Miller's gathered quite a crowd, half the town's watching to see what happens next." "That works in our favor," James said. "The more witnesses, the less likely my father is to resort to outright murder." With Thomas's help, they managed to get James on his feet. The wounded man swayed dangerously, but remained conscious through sheer force of will. "One thing I don't understand," Victoria said, as they prepared to leave the doctor's surgery. "Why would Miller shoot his own son? Even discovering your betrayal, it seems extreme even for him." A bitter smile crossed James's pale face. "It wasn't just about the journals or my betrayal. I confronted him about Sarah Harrison, told him I knew what he'd done to her." His voice hardened. "That's when he drew his gun. Said no son of his would side with that woman against his own blood." "Did he admit what happened to her?" Victoria asked quietly. James nodded, pain etching deeper lines in his face. "She's dead. Has been for 3 years. Consumption in a sanatorium back east, where he kept her isolated all this time." His voice broke slightly. "She never stopped writing letters to Charlotte and William. Letters my father collected and burned." The revelation hung heavy in the air, a final confirmation of Miller's calculated cruelty. William Harrison had lost his wife not to abandonment, but to Miller's vindictiveness, a truth that would devastate him when he learned it. "Let's finish this," Thomas said grimly. "For Sarah, for all of them." As they stepped out into the night, the distant sound of raised voices carried from the direction of the railroad office. The confrontation had already begun, and they were running out of time. The three of them moved through the back alleys of Redemption James, supported between Thomas and Victoria. Their destination, the small print shop that housed the Redemption Gazette, was dark, its owner presumably asleep at this late hour. "How do we convince Perkins to help us?" Victoria whispered as they approached the rear door. "He might just turn us in for the reward." "Perkins hates my father almost as much as he loves a sensational story," James replied. His breathing labored from the effort of walking. "Offer him the scoop of a lifetime exclusive evidence of war crimes committed by the territory's most powerful man." Thomas tried the door and found it locked. "Breaking in twice in one night," he muttered, producing a small knife to work the simple lock. "Not how I thought this day would go." The lock gave way with surprising ease, and they slipped inside the dark print shop. The smell of ink and paper filled the air along with the metallic scent of the press itself, a massive iron contraption that dominated the center of the room. Victoria found and lit a small lamp illuminating the cluttered space. Typecases lined one wall, thousands of individual metal letters organized in wooden compartments. A desk buried under papers and half-empty whiskey bottles suggested that Perkins combined journalism with serious drinking. "Now what?" Thomas asked, helping James into a chair. "We need to rouse Perkins," James said. "His room is upstairs." Before they could move, however, a shotgun cocked in the darkness of the stairwell. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't blow you all to kingdom come for breaking into my shop," came a gravelly voice. Victoria raised the lamp, revealing Ephraim Perkins, a disheveled man in his 50s with a wild beard and bloodshot eyes, currently aiming a shotgun at the intruders with surprising steadiness. "Because we're about to give you the biggest story of your career," she replied calmly. Perkins lowered the shotgun slightly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized his visitors. The Henderson girl, and James Miller, looking half dead. His gaze shifted to Thomas. "You're all over town on wanted notices. Miller's offering $500 for the lot of you." "Worth considering," Thomas acknowledged. "But how much is the exclusive story of Colonel Ezra Miller's war crimes worth? Complete with his own journals documenting atrocities against prisoners of war, and evidence of his treason against both North and South." Perkins's eyebrows shot up. "That would be worth considerably more than $500, if it were true." James leaned forward, wincing with the movement. "It's true, Perkins. My father experimented on prisoners during the war, sold intelligence to both sides to prolong the fighting. He's holding Charlotte Harrison hostage right now to recover the evidence we've found. The same evidence we're prepared to give you exclusive rights to," Victoria added, "but we need your help first." Perkins lowered the shotgun completely, his journalistic instincts clearly overriding any thought of the reward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "We need you to start setting type," Victoria explained. "A front-page story exposing Miller's crimes, and we need it visible from your front window where Miller's men can see it happening." "You want to draw him here," Perkins realized a slow smile spreading beneath his wild beard. "Force his hand." "Exactly," James confirmed. "He's desperate to contain this story. If he thinks it's about to break in print, he'll have to negotiate." Perkins considered this for a moment, then nodded sharply. "I'm in, but I want those journals afterward and exclusive rights to the whole story." "Done," Thomas agreed, "but we need to move quickly." William Harrison tried to trade himself for Charlotte. They're both being held at the railroad office. Perkins moved to the front of the shop, peering through the window toward the railroad headquarters at the end of the street. "Quite a crowd gathering there," he observed. "Miller's got men posted at every corner." "Perfect," James said grimly. "The more witnesses, the better." Perkins lit several more lamps, positioning them to be visible from the street. Then he moved to the type cases and began rapidly selecting letters, his practiced fingers working with surprising dexterity despite the alcohol on his breath. "I'll set a headline large enough to read from across the street," he explained. "Railroad Director's War Crimes Exposed." That should get his attention. As Perkins worked, Victoria helped James to the window. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," he admitted, his face shining with sweat from pain and exertion. "But I'll manage until this is finished." Thomas joined them, his expression troubled. "We're gambling everything on Miller caring about his reputation more than revenge. If we're wrong, we're not," James said with quiet certainty. "My father built his empire on the ashes of his war record. He reinvented himself as a hero, a builder of the New West. The truth would destroy everything he's created." Victoria spotted movement on the street. One of Miller's men had noticed the unusual activity in the newspaper office at this late hour. The man peered through the window, then hurried away toward the railroad headquarters. "They've seen us," she reported. "Now we wait." It didn't take long. Within 15 minutes, the door to the print shop burst open, and Colonel Ezra Miller himself stood framed in the entrance, flanked by 4 armed men. His normally immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his cold eyes taking in the scene before him with calculated fury. His gaze fell on his son, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that James had survived. Breaking and entering, theft, conspiracy, and now attempting to publish libelous falsehoods, Miller said, his voice dangerously controlled. "You've been busy tonight." "Not falsehoods, Father," James replied steadily. "Your own words, your own handwriting." Miller's gaze shifted to Perkins, who stood defiantly beside his half-completed headline type. "Mr. Perkins, I would reconsider your involvement in this matter. The railroad brings considerable advertising revenue to your little newspaper. Stories like this sell more papers than advertisements, Colonel," Perkins replied, undaunted. "War criminal traitor to both North and South, that's front-page material for weeks." Miller's composure slipped slightly. "You have no proof of such ridiculous allegations." Victoria stepped forward, her chin raised. "We have your journals. Every experiment, every death, recorded in your own hand. And we have Sarah Harrison's evidence of your sale of intelligence to both sides." For the first time, genuine alarm showed in Miller's eyes. "Where is William Harrison?" he demanded. "Safe," Victoria lied smoothly, "along with all the evidence, ready to present it to the territorial marshal if anything happens to any of us, or to Charlotte." Miller's jaw tightened. "You're bluffing. Harrison came to me 2 hours ago, offering himself in exchange for his daughter. And I'm sure you kept your word, and released Charlotte immediately," Thomas said sarcastically. A cruel smile touched Miller's lips. "Miss Williams is quite comfortable in my private rail car, awaiting departure at dawn. Harrison is keeping her company, though he's somewhat restrained at the moment." Victoria's heart sank at the confirmation that both William and Charlotte were captives, but she maintained her composure. "Then it seems we're at an impasse. You have hostages. We have evidence that will destroy you." Miller studied her carefully, clearly reassessing the situation. "What do you want?" "A trade," Victoria stated firmly. "William and Charlotte's freedom for the journals, and Sarah's evidence. And a 12-hour head start before the story breaks." James added, his gaze locked with his father's. "Time for you to leave the territory." Miller's laugh was cold. "My own son negotiating my exile. How touching." He considered for a moment, his shrewd mind visibly calculating odds and outcomes. "I accept your terms with one addition. James comes with me." "No," Victoria said immediately. "It's not negotiable," Miller insisted. "I've lost one hostage insurance. I require another. Once I'm safely away, I'll release him." "You shot him once already," Thomas pointed out. "Why would we trust you not to finish the job?" "Because he's my son," Miller replied simply. "My blood, despite his temporary lapse in loyalty." James straightened painfully. "I'll go," he said before Victoria could protest further. "But I want to see William and Charlotte released first in front of witnesses." Miller studied his son with something approaching respect. "Very well. Bring the journals and evidence to my rail car in 1 hour. We'll make the exchange there with these good townspeople as witnesses." He gestured to the crowd that had gathered outside the print shop, drawn by the confrontation. 1 hour, Victoria agreed. Not a minute more. As Miller turned to leave, James called after him. "Father, what happened to Sarah Harrison?" "The truth." Miller paused in the doorway, his back to them. "She died believing her husband would come for her someday," he said without turning. "I allowed her that small comfort at least." Then he was gone, striding back toward the railroad office with his men in tow. "Can we trust him?" Thomas asked once they were alone. "No," James replied bluntly. "He'll try to recover the evidence and keep his hostages. We need to be prepared for treachery." Victoria's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. We need the journals and evidence as leverage, but we can't risk them falling into Miller's hands." "I have an idea," Perkins interjected, his journalistic instincts fully engaged. "What if I've already made copies of the most damning pages, hidden them with instructions to publish if anything happens to any of you?" James nodded slowly. "That might work. My father understands the power of the press. If he believes the story will break regardless of whether he recovers the originals, then we have some insurance," Thomas concluded. "But we still need to get William and Charlotte away safely." Victoria moved to the window, gazing toward the railroad siding where Miller's private car waited. Dawn was approaching the eastern sky, beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly. They had 1 hour to plan their next move, and the lives of everyone she cared about hung in the balance. "We need to get those journals," she said decisively, "and then we need to prepare for the confrontation of our lives." The eastern horizon had just begun to pale when Victoria, Thomas, and James, supported between them, made their way toward the abandoned mine where the journals were hidden. Perkins had stayed behind to create his insurance, copying the most damning passages from the sample pages they'd brought and preparing them for immediate publication if anything went wrong. Dawn brought with it a biting chill, the Wyoming spring still holding winter in its grip. Victoria could see her breath clouding in the air as they moved carefully through the sagebrush, alert for any sign of Miller's men. "You think he'll honor the agreement?" she asked James, who was leaning heavily against her, his wound clearly causing him increasing pain. "No," James replied grimly. "My father never surrenders an advantage. He'll try to recover the evidence and keep his hostages." He paused, grimacing, as they navigated a rocky stretch. "But he's predictable in his methods. He'll wait until he has what he wants, then strike. So we need to be ready to strike first," Thomas concluded, scanning the landscape with the practiced eye of a veteran. The abandoned mine came into view, its weathered structures ghostly in the pre-dawn light. They approached cautiously, alert for any sign that Miller's men had discovered their hiding place. But all remained still and silent. Inside the dilapidated office, Thomas retrieved the journals from their hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. The red leather volumes seemed to glow with malevolent purpose in the gray morning light. "We're missing one," Victoria observed, counting only 5 journals. Thomas nodded. "I kept the most damning volume separate. Insurance. He reached deeper into the hiding place and withdrew the final journal along with the pouch containing Sarah Harrison's evidence. "Smart," James acknowledged. "Never put all your ammunition in one place." Victoria began securing the journals inside a saddlebag. "Even with Perkins's copies, I don't like the idea of handing these over to your father. Once he has them, what's to stop him from disappearing with William and Charlotte?" "Nothing," James admitted. "But I've been thinking. There's another approach we could take." Despite his weakened state, his eyes were sharp with calculation. "What if we don't bring all the originals? What if we bring enough to convince him, but keep the most damaging evidence hidden?" "He'd know," Thomas argued. "He wrote them. He knows exactly what they contain." "Not necessarily," James countered. "These span 3 years of activities, hundreds of entries. He can't possibly remember every detail. If we bring journals that are genuine but less comprehensive, it might buy us time." Victoria considered the idea. "It's risky, if he realizes we're holding back." "It's all risky," James said with a pained smile. "But my father's arrogance is his blind spot. He believes he's always the smartest man in any room. We can use that." After further discussion, they selected 3 of the journals to bring to the exchange, along with selected documents from Sarah's evidence, enough to convince Miller they were surrendering everything while keeping the most damning material in reserve. "Now, for the harder part," Thomas said, checking his revolver. "Getting William and Charlotte out alive." "We need more than the 3 of us," Victoria said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Miller will have at least 6 men with him." "4, James corrected. "My father prefers quality over quantity. He'll have his most trusted men, Daniels, Whitfield, Carson, and probably Matthews. Ex-soldiers, all of them. Good with guns." "Still bad odds," Thomas observed. Victoria's mind raced through possibilities. "What about the miners? The ones Miller forced off their claims? They have reason to help us." "Too far," Thomas said with a shake of his head. "No time to reach their camp and return before the deadline." James straightened slightly, a new thought crossing his pain-lined face. "There is someone who might help. Frank Donovan." "The saloon owner?" Victoria asked skeptically. "Former Union cavalry officer," James explained. "Lost his leg at Gettysburg. He has no love for my father, who's been trying to buy his property for months, and he employs several veterans who might be persuaded to assist." "It's worth a try," Thomas decided. "Victoria, you go. James and I will prepare for the exchange." Victoria hesitated, reluctant to leave them. "Are you sure James can barely stand?" "I'll manage," James assured her, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Donovan respects you. He's more likely to help if you ask." With a final concerned glance at her father and James, Victoria mounted her horse and rode toward town. The rising sun cast long shadows across the landscape as she urged her mare to a gallop, acutely aware of how little time remained before their deadline with Miller. Redemption was stirring to life as she approached early risers moving about their business despite the unusual events of the night. Victoria kept to the back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where Miller's men might be watching. She tethered her horse behind the livery stable and made her way to Donovan's saloon through the narrow gap between buildings. The saloon was quiet at this early hour, the previous night's revelry leaving behind only the lingering scents of whiskey and tobacco smoke. Frank Donovan was behind the bar, his wooden leg thumping rhythmically as he moved about, preparing for the day's business. He looked up sharply as Victoria entered through the back door, his hand moving instinctively to the shotgun kept beneath the bar. "Miss Henderson," he said, relaxing slightly as he recognized her, "you're a brave woman showing your face in town with Miller's men hunting for you." "I need your help, Mr. Donovan," Victoria said without preamble. "Miller's holding William Harrison and his daughter hostage. We're making an exchange in less than an hour, but we're outnumbered." Donovan's weathered face hardened. "Miller's business is none of mine, Miss Henderson. I've managed to stay neutral in this town for good reason." "There is no neutral with men like Miller," Victoria countered. "You know that as well as I do. Today, it's the Harrisons and my family. Tomorrow, it could be anyone who stands in his way, including you." The saloon keeper's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you trading for the hostages?" Victoria hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Evidence of war crimes. Miller conducted experiments on Union prisoners during the war. He also sold intelligence to both sides, prolonging the fighting for profit." Donovan's face registered shock, then a deep, burning anger. "Experiments on prisoners." Victoria nodded grimly. "We have his own journals documenting everything. Men tortured to death to satisfy his curiosity. Men like the ones you commanded at Gettysburg." Donovan was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if seeing ghosts from his past. Finally, he reached beneath the bar and produced not the shotgun, but a cavalry saber, its blade still bright despite the years. "I lost 32 men under my command," he said quietly. "Good men. Some died quickly, some lingered in prison camps." His fingers tightened around the saber's hilt. "If what you're saying is true—" "It's true," Victoria assured him. "James Miller himself has confirmed it. He's turned against his father, helping us expose these crimes." Donovan's eyebrows rose at this information. "The Colonel's own son. That I didn't expect." He seemed to come to a decision, setting the saber on the bar with purpose. "I have 4 men who ride with me, veterans, all of them, reliable in a fight." Hope rose in Victoria's chest. "Will they help us?" "They will if I ask them to," Donovan confirmed. "Where is this exchange taking place?" "Miller's private rail car. 1 hour from now, less at this point." Donovan nodded sharply. "My men and I will be nearby. We won't show ourselves unless needed, but we'll be watching. If Miller tries anything—" He left the threat unfinished. "Thank you," Victoria said with genuine gratitude. "This could make the difference between life and death for all of us." As she turned to leave, Donovan called after her. "Miss Henderson, you should know there's talk that the territorial marshal is on his way to redemption, due to arrive by noon today." Victoria's pulse quickened at this news. "Official business. Apparently someone telegraphed him about irregularities in the railroad's land acquisitions," Donovan said with a meaningful look. "Someone with connections back east." "James?" Victoria realized. He must have sent the telegram before confronting his father. "If you can hold out until the marshal arrives," Donovan suggested. Victoria shook her head reluctantly. "We can't wait. Miller's threatening to leave with the hostages on the morning train. But knowing the marshal is coming, that could be useful." With renewed determination, she slipped out the back door and made her way through town, alert for any sign of Miller's men. The knowledge that help was coming both from Donovan and later from the territorial marshal gave her hope that they might yet survive this confrontation. When she returned to the rendezvous point, she found Thomas and James examining a rough map of the railroad siding, planning their approach. "Donovan's with us," she reported. "He and 4 men will be nearby during the exchange, ready to intervene if Miller betrays us." Thomas looked up, relief evident in his face. "That evens the odds somewhat." "There's more," Victoria continued. "The territorial marshal is due in redemption by noon today. James apparently telegraphed him about the railroad's land schemes." James nodded weakly. "Insurance. I wasn't sure if he'd respond, but it seems he's taking the allegations seriously." "So we just need to survive until noon," Thomas observed grimly. That's assuming Miller doesn't know about the marshal, Victoria pointed out. If he does, it explains why he's in such a hurry to leave. He knows, James confirmed. My father has informants in the telegraph office. It's why he moved up his timetable, why he's so desperate to recover the evidence before the authorities arrive. Victoria checked her revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded. Then he'll be even more dangerous. A cornered predator. We should get moving, Thomas urged, noting the position of the sun. Our hour is nearly up. They gathered their carefully selected evidence enough to convince Miller they were surrendering everything while keeping the most damning material hidden, and mounted their horses. James, despite his injury, insisted on riding alone, though the effort clearly cost him dearly. As they approached Redemption, Victoria could see activity around the railroad siding at the eastern edge of town. Miller's private car, an elegant Pullman with the Pacific Railroad's emblem emblazoned on its side, sat on a spur line, steam rising from the attached locomotive. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, and a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered at a distance, drawn by the unusual spectacle and the rumors sweeping through Redemption. Remember the plan, Thomas said quietly as they rode closer. I approach first with the journals. Victoria, you stay back with James until we verify William and Charlotte are alive and unharmed. If anything goes wrong, we're ready, Victoria assured him, though her stomach knotted with tension. They halted their horses at the edge of the railroad yard. Miller stood on the platform of his private car, immaculately dressed despite the early hour, his cold gaze fixing on them as they appeared. Behind him, partially visible through the car's windows, Victoria could make out two figures, William and Charlotte, both apparently bound. Right on time, Miller called, checking his pocket watch with theatrical precision. I appreciate punctuality, even in my adversaries. Thomas dismounted the saddlebag containing the journals slung over his shoulder. Let's get this over with, Miller. Show me Harrison and his daughter alive and unharmed. Miller gestured, and one of his men brought William and Charlotte onto the platform. William's face was bruised, his wrists bound before him, but he stood straight, his eyes searching the area until they found Victoria. Charlotte appeared physically unharmed, but terrified, her young face streaked with tears. Satisfied? Miller inquired coldly. Now the journals and evidence, all of it. Thomas took a step forward, but Miller raised a hand to stop him. Not you, Henderson. Send your daughter, a sign of good faith. Victoria and Thomas exchanged glances. This wasn't part of their plan, but refusing would only escalate tensions. Go, Thomas said quietly. But be careful. Victoria dismounted, taking the saddlebag from her father. As she approached the rail car, she scanned the surrounding area, noting the positions of Miller's men, and with some relief, the barely visible figures of Donovan and his veterans taking up strategic positions among the freight crates and outbuildings. That's far enough, Miller commanded when she was halfway to the platform. Show me what you've brought. Victoria opened the saddlebag, displaying the red leather journals and the documents from Sarah's evidence. 3 journals and Sarah Harrison's proof of your treason against both North and South, as agreed. Miller's eyes narrowed. 3. There were 6 journals. These are the ones that matter, Victoria replied steadily. The ones that detail your experiments and your sale of intelligence. The others are merely medical observations, gruesome, but not explicitly criminal. It was a calculated risk, and for a moment Victoria thought Miller would call her bluff, but his desire to conclude the exchange quickly apparently outweighed his suspicion. Bring them here, he ordered. Slowly. Victoria ascended the steps to the platform, acutely aware of how vulnerable she was. At close range, she could see the cold calculation in Miller's eyes, the complete absence of humanity, that had allowed him to conduct his wartime atrocities. "Here," she said, holding out the saddlebag. Miller took it, handing it to one of his men. "Check them," he instructed. "Make sure they're genuine." The man quickly examined the contents, nodding confirmation. "It's his handwriting, sir, and the Confederate documents appear authentic." Miller smiled thinly. "Excellent. Now, as agreed, the Harrisons are free to go." He gestured to his men to untie William and Charlotte. "And your son," Victoria pressed. "He wasn't part of our original agreement." "James stays with me," Miller said firmly. "A father-son reunion is long overdue." Victoria held her ground. "That wasn't our understanding. James comes with us." Miller's expression hardened. "My son, my terms. Unless you'd prefer I examine these journals more carefully right now to ensure you haven't withheld anything important." It was a stalemate broken unexpectedly by James himself, who had dismounted and was approaching the platform despite his obvious pain. "It's all right, Victoria," he called. "I'll go with him. Get William and Charlotte to safety." Miller's smile was triumphant as James joined them on the platform. "At least my son remembers the importance of family loyalty." He turned to his men. "Release the prisoners." William and Charlotte were untied and guided to the platform steps. As they passed Victoria, William whispered urgently, "It's a trap. He has men positioned on the water tower, sharpshooters." Victoria's blood ran cold as she processed this warning. She glanced up, barely making out the silhouette of a man with a rifle on the distant water tower overlooking the rail yard. "Go," she told William and Charlotte quietly. "Get to Thomas. Tell him about the sharpshooters." As they hurried toward Thomas, Victoria remained on the platform, unwilling to leave James alone with his father. Miller was already giving orders to his men, preparing for immediate departure. "You never intended to honor our agreement," Victoria said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "You were planning to eliminate us all along." Miller turned to her with cold amusement. "My dear Miss Henderson, in business as in war, one must leverage every advantage. Surely you didn't expect me to simply surrender and ride away into exile." "I expected basic human decency," Victoria replied, buying time as she saw Thomas organizing William and Charlotte, no doubt preparing for the coming confrontation. "But I forgot who I was dealing with. A man who experimented on helpless prisoners, who betrayed both sides in a war for personal profit." Miller's amusement vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You understand nothing about necessity, about progress. The weak have always been sacrificed for the advancement of the strong. It is the natural order." "There's nothing natural about torture," James interjected, his voice weak but clear. "Nothing necessary about the pain you inflicted. It was simple cruelty, Father. Cruelty and a profound moral emptiness." Miller's face flushed with anger. "Sanctimonious words from a pampered boy who's never had to make difficult choices. You think the world runs on nobility and good intentions. It runs on power and will." He turned to his men. "Prepare to depart, and signal Matthews on the water tower. It's time to conclude our business here." Victoria saw one of Miller's men raise a small mirror, flashing a signal toward the water tower. In that moment, she knew they were out of time. "Get down!" she shouted to James simultaneously, drawing her revolver and firing at the man with the signal mirror. Her shot went wide, but achieved its purpose. Chaos erupted instantly. Miller's men drew their weapons as Thomas, from his position near the horses, opened fire. The civilians in the crowd scattered, seeking cover, as bullets began flying across the railroad yard. Victoria grabbed James and pulled him down behind a stack of freight crates on the platform, as Miller retreated into the rail car, barking orders to his men. A shot from the water tower splintered the wood inches from her head. "We need to get off this platform," she urged James. "We're too exposed." From their position, Victoria could see Thomas, William, and Charlotte taking cover behind a freight wagon. Donovan and his men had emerged from hiding and were exchanging fire with Miller's guards, the veteran cavalryman directing his small force with practiced skill. A bullet struck the crate above Victoria's head, showering her with splinters. The sharpshooter on the water tower had them pinned down, making any movement across the open platform suicidal. "The locomotive," James gasped, pointing to the cab of the engine attached to Miller's private car. "If we can reach it, we can disconnect it from the colonel's car. Strand him here until the marshal arrives." It was a desperate plan, but they had few options. The locomotive was less than 20 feet away, but reaching it meant crossing open ground under the sharpshooter's fire. "Cover us!" Victoria shouted to Thomas, who nodded in understanding. Thomas and William concentrated their fire on the water tower, forcing the sharpshooter to duck behind the tank. In that moment, Victoria and James made their dash across the platform, bullets striking the planks at their feet as Miller's men recovered from their initial surprise. They reached the locomotive cab, Victoria practically dragging the weakened James inside. The engineer was nowhere to be seen, having wisely abandoned his post when the shooting started. "Can you operate this thing?" Victoria asked, scanning the bewildering array of levers and gauges. "Basic principles only," James admitted, "but enough to move it. We need to disconnect from the passenger car first." Victoria peered out cautiously. The coupling between the locomotive and Miller's private car was just a few feet away, but reaching it meant exposing herself to fire from both the water tower and Miller's men. A new burst of gunfire drew her attention. Donovan and his veterans had maneuvered to a position where they could target the sharpshooter, forcing him to retreat from his perch. Thomas and William were advancing cautiously, using the chaos to work their way closer to the platform. "Now's our chance," Victoria decided, slipping out of the cab toward the coupling. The mechanism was heavy and designed for operation by men with far greater strength, but desperation lent Victoria power she didn't know she possessed. She struggled with the locking pin, finally wrenching it free as bullets struck the metal around her. "Victoria!" James called in warning. She looked up to see Miller himself standing on the platform of his private car, revolver aimed directly at her. There was no time to draw her own weapon, no place to seek cover. The gunshot was deafening at such close range. Victoria staggered back, expecting to feel pain, but it was Miller who jerked violently, a bloom of red appearing on his immaculate white shirt. Behind him stood Charlotte Harrison Williams' revolver, still smoking in her shaking hands. Miller's expression was one of almost comical surprise as he looked down at his wound, then back at the young woman who'd shot him. He crumpled slowly to his knees, the revolver falling from his grasp. Charlotte stood frozen. The gun still extended her face, a mask of shock at what she'd done. "Charlotte!" Victoria called urgently. "Come here, quickly!" The girl seemed to wake from a trance, dropping the revolver and stumbling toward Victoria, who pulled her into the relative safety of the locomotive. "I killed him," Charlotte whispered, trembling violently. "I killed a man." "And you saved my life," Victoria corrected her, checking quickly to ensure the girl was unharmed. "You did what you had to do." James had managed to engage the locomotive's system steam building as the engine prepared to move. "We need to go," he urged. "His men will regroup quickly." Victoria helped Charlotte to a secure position, then turned her attention to the ongoing gunfight. Thomas and William had nearly reached the platform, while Donovan and his men were effectively pinning down Miller's remaining guards. "Pa!" she shouted. "We're taking the locomotive. Get everyone clear." Thomas acknowledged with a wave, directing William and the others to fall back from the tracks. Miller's private car, now disconnected from the locomotive, sat stranded on the spur line along with its owner, whose fate remained uncertain. James opened the throttle, and the locomotive began to move slowly at first, then with increasing speed. As they pulled away from the rail yard, Victoria caught a final glimpse of Miller's men rushing to their fallen leader. The fight seemingly gone out of them with the colonel's fall. They continued for about a mile down the main line before James reduced speed and brought the locomotive to a halt at a small water stop. "We need to go back," he said, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. "The marshal will be arriving soon. He'll need statements, evidence." Victoria nodded, helping James from the cab. Charlotte remained huddled where Victoria had placed her, her young face aged by the morning's events. "Charlotte," Victoria said gently, "your father is safe. You saved us all with your courage." The girl looked up, her eyes hollow with shock. "I never thought that I would take a life," Victoria finished for her. "None of us knows what we're capable of until the moment comes. You did what was necessary to protect others. There's no shame in that." As they prepared to walk back to town, Victoria spotted riders approaching Thomas William and several of Donovan's men. Relief flooded through her at the sight of her father apparently unharmed despite the firefight. They rode up alongside the stationary locomotive, Thomas quickly dismounting to embrace his daughter. "Thank God you're safe," he murmured, holding her tight. "When I saw Miller aiming at you—" "Charlotte saved me," Victoria said, looking toward the girl who was now in her father's protective embrace. "She showed more courage than any of us." William Harrison held his daughter as if he'd never let her go again, his own face wet with tears of relief and gratitude. "My brave girl," he whispered. "My Sarah would be so proud of you." James, leaning heavily against the locomotive, addressed the group. "Miller, is he—" "Alive," Thomas confirmed. "The bullet missed his heart. Donovan's men have him under guard at the doctor's surgery. He'll live to stand trial for his crimes." "And his men?" Victoria asked. "Surrendered once their leader fell," one of Donovan's veterans reported. "Town's in quite an uproar, but things are calming down now that the shooting's stopped." Victoria felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. They had survived against all odds. Miller was captured, his crimes would be exposed, and justice might finally be served for his many victims. As they prepared to return to redemption, Victoria glanced at the eastern horizon, where the sun had fully risen on a new day. The nightmare wasn't over. There would be statements to give evidence, to present a trial to witness. But the darkest hour had passed, and they had emerged battered but unbroken into the light. The territorial marshal would arrive by noon, bringing with him the authority of law to a land that had for too long been ruled by power and corruption. For the first time since the confrontation began, Victoria allowed herself to believe that they had truly won. James Miller, still pale, but somehow stronger now that his father's reign of terror was ending, managed a weak smile. "What happens now?" he asked, his gaze moving between Victoria and his former adversaries, now unlikely allies. "Now," Thomas said firmly, "we make sure justice is done. Not just for us, but for everyone Miller has harmed. The prisoners he tortured, Sarah Harrison, all the families driven from their land. And after that," James pressed his eyes, lingering on Victoria. She met his gaze steadily, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of possibilities that neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. "After that," she replied, "we rebuild, all of us together." As they made their way back toward redemption, Victoria rode alongside Charlotte, concerned for the young woman's state of mind after the trauma she'd endured. The first time is the hardest, she said quietly, so only Charlotte could hear. Taking a life even to save others. It changes you. Charlotte looked up, her young face solemn. Does the feeling ever go away? The heaviness inside? Victoria thought of her father, of the ghosts that still haunted him from the war, of the men he'd been forced to kill since coming to Wyoming. Not entirely, she admitted, but it becomes bearable, especially when you remember why you did it, to protect those you love. Charlotte nodded slowly, absorbing this truth. I keep seeing his face, the surprise in his eyes when the bullet hit him. That's natural, Victoria assured her. It will fade with time. I don't regret it, Charlotte said with sudden firmness. He would have killed you. After everything he did to my mother, to all those prisoners, I don't regret stopping him. Victoria reached across to squeeze the girl's hand. Your mother would be proud of your courage. William, too. As they approached the outskirts of Redemption, they could see unusual activity in the streets. A crowd had gathered near the doctor's surgery, and mounted men in territorial police uniforms were visible. The marshals arrived early, Thomas observed, spurring his horse forward. Victoria and the others followed, entering town to find a scene of controlled chaos. Miller's remaining men were being disarmed and placed under arrest by the marshal's deputies. Townsfolk gathered in small groups, discussing the morning's events in excited tones. And standing on the steps of the doctor's surgery was a tall, imposing figure in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, Territorial Marshal Nathan Hollister. Henderson, he called as Thomas approached. I've heard quite a story from the saloon keeper. Something about war crimes, railroad corruption, and a shootout at dawn. Thomas dismounted, extending his hand to the lawman. All true, Marshal, and we have the evidence to prove it. Hollister's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes showed keen interest. Miller's been raising hell across 3 territories with his railroad schemes. But war crimes, that's federal business. Serious charges. We have his own journals, Victoria said, joining her father. Detailed records of experiments on Union prisoners, and evidence he sold intelligence to both sides during the war. The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. That would explain the telegram I received from Washington this morning. Seems someone with influence has taken an interest in Colonel Miller's activities. He glanced at James, who was being helped from his horse. You're doing, I presume, Mr. Miller? James nodded weakly. I have connections in the War Department, former classmates who took my concerns seriously. Well, they're sending a federal prosecutor on the next train, Hollister informed them. Miller won't be building railroads or terrorizing settlers anymore, that's certain. Victoria felt a surge of relief at these words. The nightmare truly was ending. What about our land? William asked, still supporting Charlotte protectively. The railroad's claims, null and void as far as I'm concerned, the marshal replied firmly. Any transactions made under duress or through fraud won't stand. I'll make sure of that personally. As the group dispersed to give their statements to the marshal's deputies, Victoria found herself standing beside James, who was awaiting medical attention for his reopened wound. You did it, he said quietly. You stood against my father and won. Not many have managed that. We did it, Victoria corrected him. All of us together. Including you, perhaps, especially you. Turning against your own father couldn't have been easy. James's gaze was distant, troubled. I keep asking myself how I didn't see it sooner. The signs were always there. I just refused to acknowledge them. We often don't see what we don't want to see, Victoria said gently, especially when it comes to family. He looked at her, then really looked at her, as if seeing past the exterior to something deeper within. What will you do now? Return to your ranch? Victoria nodded. It's our home. We fought for it. We'll rebuild what Miller tried to destroy. She hesitated, then added, What about you? Will you stay with the railroad? A bitter laugh escaped him. Hardly. I suspect my career with the Pacific Railroad is thoroughly finished. His expression grew more serious. But perhaps that's for the best. A chance to start fresh, to build something that doesn't rely on corruption and suffering. There was a question in his eyes, one he couldn't quite bring himself to ask. Victoria found herself wondering about possibilities she'd never considered a life beyond the isolation of the ranch. Perhaps even a partnership with this complicated man who'd risked everything for what was right. But such thoughts were premature. There was still much to be resolved, wounds both physical and emotional, that needed time to heal. Whatever you decide, she said simply, you have friends here now, people who will stand with you. It wasn't a promise, not exactly. But it was an opening a door left ajar to whatever might come next. As the sun climbed higher in the Wyoming sky, Victoria looked around at the unlikely allies brought together by Miller's schemes, her father finding redemption for his wartime choices. William and Charlotte Harrison survivors who'd lost so much but might yet find happiness. James Miller separated forever from his father's shadow, and herself a woman who'd discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. For the first time in years, Victoria allowed herself to imagine what that future might hold, not just survival in this harsh land, but perhaps something more. Something worth building, worth fighting for. Whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by the trials they'd endured and the justice they'd fought to achieve in this lawless frontier. 3 days after the confrontation at the railroad yard, Victoria stood on the porch of the Henderson ranch house, watching the sun rise over the distant mountains. The landscape remained unchanged, the same rolling hills covered with sagebrush, the same rugged peaks on the horizon, but everything else had been transformed by the events in Redemption. Colonel Ezra Miller lay in the town jail under guard. His gunshot wound treated, but his future grim. The federal prosecutor had arrived on yesterday's train, bringing with him a stack of warrants and a determination to see justice done. Miller's remaining men had either been arrested or had fled the territory, and the Pacific Railroad's operations had ground to a halt pending investigation. Victoria sipped her coffee, savoring the moment of quiet, before the day began in earnest. Her father was already out checking the cattle, his steps lighter now that the shadow of Miller's blackmail had been lifted. Margaret moved about inside the house, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Another sign that life was slowly returning to normal. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Victoria's attention. A single rider was coming up the trail to their ranch. William Harrison, riding with a straight back and clear eyes that bore little resemblance to the broken alcoholic of just a week ago. "Morning, Victoria," he called as he dismounted. "Hope I'm not intruding too early." "Not at all," she replied, offering him coffee. "How's Charlotte?" William's expression softened at the mention of his daughter. "Better. The nightmares are less frequent. Dr. Abernathy says the shock is fading." He accepted the cup gratefully. "She's strong like her mother. Stronger than I ever gave her credit for." Victoria nodded, understanding the complex mixture of pride and concern in his voice. Charlotte's actions had saved Victoria's life, but taking Miller's shot had exacted its own toll on the young woman's spirit. "And you?" she asked. "How are you holding up?" William gazed thoughtfully into his coffee. "Sober, 4 days now." He said it without pride or shame, simply stating a fact. "Knowing what happened to Sarah, that she never abandoned us, it's changed everything. I have a reason to stay clear-headed now. For Charlotte." for Sarah's memory. Have you told Charlotte the full truth about her mother? Most of it, William confirmed. She deserves to know how brave Sarah was standing up to Miller when she discovered what he was doing. A shadow crossed his face. The hardest part was telling her that her mother died, believing we might someday be reunited. That Sarah wrote all those letters Miller never delivered. Victoria laid a hand on his arm in silent sympathy. The cruelty of Miller's actions extended far beyond his wartime atrocities, the lives he'd destroyed, the families he'd torn apart in the years since, all in service to his ambition and his determination to bury the past. I came to ask a favor, William said after a moment. The marshal has recovered Sarah's letters from Miller's papers. He's releasing them to me today. His voice grew uncertain. I'm not sure I can face reading them alone. Charlotte's too young to bear that burden. But I thought, perhaps you— Of course, Victoria said without hesitation. I'll be there. Relief washed over William's face. Thank you. The marshal wants us all in town anyway. Final statements before they transport Miller to Cheyenne for trial. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, watching the Wyoming landscape come alive with morning light. Despite everything, there was a peace to this moment, that Victoria treasured the simple act of sharing coffee with a neighbor, free from the fear and tension that had dominated their lives for so long. There's something else, William said eventually. Something I haven't told anyone yet. Not even Charlotte. Victoria turned to him, curious. I'm going back to medicine, he announced, a note of wonder in his voice, as if he could hardly believe it himself. Dr. Abernathy has offered me a position as his partner, says his hands aren't steady enough for surgery anymore, and the territory needs someone with my training. William, that's wonderful, Victoria said, genuinely pleased. You were a gifted surgeon before I gave myself to the bottle, he finished for her. I know. It won't be easy earning back people's trust. But it's time I started rebuilding my life, honoring Sarah's memory by becoming the man she believed I could be. Victoria studied him, noting how different he looked without the haunted expression that had been his constant companion for years. There was purpose in his eyes now, and dignity in the set of his shoulders. The town will be lucky to have you, she said sincerely. William nodded his thanks, then gestured toward the house. We should get your father. The marshals called a town meeting for 10 o'clock. Something about the future of redemption now that Miller's influence is gone. As if on cue, Thomas rode in from the range, his expression brightening at the sight of their visitor. Harrison, good to see you, vertical and sober. The two men shook hands with the easy camaraderie that had developed between them during their shared ordeal. Within half an hour, all three were riding toward town, leaving Margaret to mind the ranch with promises to return before nightfall. Redemption was transformed from the tense, fearful settlement of recent days. People moved about the streets with a new energy, conversing openly where once they might have whispered. The railroad headquarters stood empty, its doors locked and windows shuttered, a monument to fallen power. They tethered their horses outside the town hall, where a crowd was already gathering for the marshal's meeting. Inside, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. As townsfolk filled the benches, their conversations a low buzz of speculation about what would come next. Victoria spotted Charlotte sitting near the front. Her blonde hair neatly arranged, her posture straight, despite the whispers that followed her. The girl who'd shot Colonel Miller, saving Victoria Henderson's life in the process. William immediately went to join his daughter, embracing her with the fierce protectiveness of a father who'd nearly lost everything. Miss Henderson. Victoria turned to find James Miller standing beside her, looking remarkably improved from the last time she'd seen him. His color had returned, and though he still moved carefully to protect his healing wound, he no longer had the ashen appearance of a man at death's door. "James," she greeted him warmly, "you're looking better." "Dr. Abernathy is a skilled physician," he replied with a small smile, "though he claims I'm the worst patient he's had since the war." Victoria laughed softly. "Somehow, that doesn't surprise me." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an awareness of possibilities of paths that might converge now that the immediate crisis had passed. Before either could give voice to these thoughts, Marshal Hollister called the meeting to order. The tall lawman stood at the front of the hall, his weathered face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Folks," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "I've called you here to address several matters concerning the future of redemption and surrounding properties." He outlined the legal proceedings against Miller, the federal charges of war crimes and treason, the territorial charges of corruption, extortion, and attempted murder. Colonel Miller will be transported to Cheyenne tomorrow for arraignment, then to Denver for trial. Given the evidence against him, I don't expect he'll ever see the outside of a prison again. A murmur of satisfaction ran through the crowd. Hollister raised a hand for silence. As for the Pacific Railroad's operations in this territory, they've been suspended pending a full investigation. Land acquisitions made under Miller's direction are being reviewed for legality. He nodded toward Thomas and William. Those who were forced to sell or sign over property rights under duress will have their land returned. Relief washed over Thomas's face at this confirmation, though Victoria had never doubted the outcome. The evidence of Miller's methods was too overwhelming, the witnesses too numerous for any other result. "That brings me to the matter of the railroad itself," Hollister continued. "The territorial governor recognizes the importance of the transcontinental connection for Wyoming's development. The railroad will eventually continue, but under new management and with proper oversight to ensure fair dealings with landowners." Victoria glanced at James, wondering how this news affected him. His expression remained neutral, but she sensed a tension in his shoulders, the weight of decisions yet to be made. "Finally," the marshal said, "there's the question of local governance. With Miller's influence removed, redemption needs leadership, honest leadership." He surveyed the room thoughtfully. "I'm appointing Thomas Henderson as interim sheriff until proper elections can be held." A shocked murmur ran through the room. No one looked more surprised than Thomas himself. "Marshal, I'm a rancher, not a lawman," he protested. Hollister's expression remained firm. "You're a veteran who's demonstrated integrity under pressure, Henderson. The kind of man this town needs while it recovers from Miller's influence. You'll have deputies' training and my support from Cheyenne." His tone made it clear the matter wasn't open for debate. "Consider it your civic duty." Victoria watched her father's face as he processed this unexpected turn of events. Despite his initial protest, she could see that the appointment resonated with something deep within him, the desire to serve, to protect, to ensure justice prevailed where once corruption had reigned. After a moment, Thomas nodded his acceptance, his weathered face solemn with the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. The meeting continued with various administrative matters, but Victoria found her attention drawn to James, who sat quietly absorbing the proceedings, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. There was something different about him now, a clarity of purpose that hadn't been there before, as if his near-death experience and betrayal of his father had burned away some internal confusion. When the meeting concluded, the townsfolk dispersed in groups, discussing the dramatic changes to their community. Victoria approached the marshal, who was speaking with her father about the details of his new position. "Marshal Hollister," she interrupted politely, William Harrison mentioned you'd recovered Sarah's letters from Miller's papers. The lawman nodded, reaching into his coat to produce a packet tied with string. Found these in Miller's personal safe. Letters spanning almost 10 years never delivered. His expression hardened. Just one more cruelty among many. William joined them, his face a mixture of apprehension and hope as he eyed the packet. Thank you, Marshal. These mean everything. Take them, Hollister said kindly. Maybe they'll bring some peace to you and your daughter. As William accepted the precious bundle, Charlotte appeared at his side, her eyes widening at the sight of her mother's handwriting on the topmost envelope. Are those? She whispered. William nodded, putting his arm around her shoulders. Your mother's letters, Charlotte. The ones she wrote all those years thinking we would receive them. Charlotte touched the packet reverently, tears filling her eyes. Can we read them now? William looked at Victoria, a silent reminder of his earlier request for her support. I thought we might go to the cafe, he suggested gently. Victoria has offered to join us if that's all right with you. Charlotte nodded, seemingly relieved that they wouldn't face this emotional task alone. Yes, please. I'd like that. As they turned to leave, James approached, hesitant to intrude on the family moment. Mr. Harrison, he said formally, I wanted to apologize for my father's actions, for what he did to your wife, to your family. William studied the younger man, perhaps seeing for the first time how different he was from his father. You have nothing to apologize for, James. You helped expose the truth, brought Sarah's story to light. He extended his hand. In my book, that makes you a friend. James accepted the handshake, visible relief crossing his features. Thank you. That means more than you know. Charlotte, still processing the existence of her mother's letters, looked up at James with new understanding. You knew her. You received her letters all those years. James nodded solemnly. She was a remarkable woman, Charlotte, brave and determined. She never stopped loving you and your father, never stopped trying to reach you. Charlotte's eyes filled with fresh tears. Would you join us to read the letters you knew her when we couldn't? You might help us understand. James looked startled by the invitation, then deeply moved. If you're certain, I'd be honored. Victoria watched this exchange with a swelling heart, marveling at Charlotte's capacity for grace, despite all she'd endured. The girl who'd been forced to shoot a man to save Victoria's life was extending compassion to the son of her mother's captor, finding connection where there might have been only bitterness. The four of them walked to the small cafe on the corner of Redemption's main street, a quiet group united by shared trauma and the promise of healing. They settled at a corner table, ordered coffee, and William carefully untied the packet of letters. Sarah always had beautiful handwriting, he said softly, tracing the elegant script on the first envelope. She taught penmanship to supplement our income when I was establishing my practice. He opened the earliest letter with trembling fingers, dated just months after Sarah's disappearance. As he began to read aloud, his voice broke on the words of love and longing, the desperate explanations of why she had left the promises to return when it was safe. Victoria sat quietly, bearing witness to this bittersweet reunion across time and space. Charlotte wept silently as her father read her mother's words, finally learning the truth of the woman who had given her life, then sacrificed everything to protect her family from Miller's threats. James listened with downcast eyes, occasionally offering context from his own memories, explaining how his father had intercepted the letters, how Sarah had been kept isolated, but determined to maintain contact, believing that someday her messages would reach their intended recipients. Letter after letter, revealed Sarah's enduring love, her declining health, and her unwavering hope that someday justice would prevail. The final letter, written just weeks before her death, contained a passage that brought them all to tears. "My dearest William and Charlotte, I feel my strength fading, but not my love for you. If you are reading this, then somehow the truth has finally come to light. Do not mourn me with bitterness, but remember me with joy. Live the lives I dreamed for you, William, healing others as you always were meant to do. Charlotte, growing into the strong, beautiful woman I know you will become. Find happiness again. Forgive not for the sake of those who wronged us, but for your own heart's peace. And know that I will love you both always beyond this life, and into whatever comes next." When William finished reading the final letter, there wasn't a dry eye at the table. Charlotte leaned against her father, their shared grief somehow made lighter by the knowledge of Sarah's enduring love. "She never gave up," Charlotte whispered. "All those years, she kept trying to reach us." "And now she has," William said, holding the letters like the precious treasures they were. "After all this time, she's found her way home to us." They sat in silence for a time, each absorbed in their own reflections. Victoria found herself deeply moved by Sarah Harrison's courage and the long-delayed reunion of her words with her family. It was a reminder of how Miller's cruelty had rippled outward, touching countless lives, but also how those ripples could finally be stilled by truth and justice. James was the first to speak, his voice subdued. "I should leave you two with your memories. This is a family moment." As he rose to depart, Charlotte surprised him by catching his hand. "You're part of this too, James. You kept my mother's memory alive when no one else could. You believed her when your father wouldn't." James's composure faltered at these words of grace from the young woman who had every reason to hate his family name. "Thank you, Charlotte. That means everything." He excused himself nonetheless, understanding the need for William and Charlotte to process their emotions privately. Victoria followed him outside, sensing he too might need a moment of support. They stood in the clear Wyoming sunlight, the bustling activity of redemption continuing around them, a town already beginning to reshape itself in the absence of Miller's oppressive influence. "Are you all right?" Victoria asked softly. James considered the question with the thoughtfulness she'd come to expect from him. "I'm not sure 'all right' is the correct term," he finally replied. "But I'm finding my way forward, I think, trying to reconcile the man I thought my father was with the monster he actually became." "That can't be easy," Victoria acknowledged. "No," James agreed, "but necessary. I enabled him for years, Victoria, made excuses, looked the other way. I can't undo that, but I can try to make amends." And there was a new resolve in his voice that caught Victoria's attention. "You have plans?" James nodded slowly. "I've been offered a position with the Justice Department, using my knowledge of railroad operations to investigate corruption in other territories. It seems my telegram to Washington made an impression on certain officials." Victoria felt a curious mixture of emotions at this news, pride in his chosen path, but also a surprising pang of something like disappointment. "You're leaving Redemption, then?" "Eventually," James confirmed. "Once the investigation here is complete, and my father's trial is underway." He hesitated, then added, "Unless there was a reason to stay." The question hung between them, unspoken but clear. Victoria found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated when this all began. Feelings for this complicated man, this son of their enemy, who had risked everything to stand for justice. "I can't answer that yet," she said honestly. There's been too much change too quickly. We all need time to find our footing in this new reality. James nodded, accepting her caution without offense. Time is something I can offer. I'll be here for at least a month while the federal investigation proceeds. And I'll be here, Victoria replied simply, helping my father adjust to his new role as sheriff, rebuilding our ranch, moving forward. A smile touched James's lips, a genuine one that reached his eyes, transforming his serious face. Moving forward. I like the sound of that. They walked together through the streets of Redemption, speaking of practical matters, the return of seized lands, the reorganization of the railroad's operations, the changing dynamics of the community now that Miller's influence was gone. Beneath this ordinary conversation ran a current of possibility of connections forming that neither had expected. As they passed the jail, Marshal Hollister emerged, his expression grim. "Miller's asking to see you, James," he said without preamble. "Says he has matters to discuss before his transfer to Cheyenne tomorrow." James stiffened visibly. "I have nothing to say to him." "Understood," Hollister replied. "Just passing along the message. It's your choice." After the marshal departed, James stood motionless, conflict evident in his face. Victoria waited, understanding the weight of the decision before him. "I should refuse," he said finally. "After everything he's done, why give him the satisfaction of an audience? Perhaps the question is whether you need the closure," Victoria suggested gently. "Not what he deserves, but what might help you move forward." James considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're right. There are things I need to say to him, questions only he can answer." He turned to her, uncertain. Would you wait? I won't be long." "I'll be here," Victoria promised. She watched as James squared his shoulders and entered the jailhouse, carrying himself with a dignity that spoke of the man he was becoming, not defined by his father's crimes, but by his own courage and integrity. While waiting, Victoria caught sight of her father emerging from the marshal's office, now wearing a sheriff's badge on his vest. The sight was both strange and somehow fitting. Thomas Henderson, once haunted by wartime choices, now entrusted with maintaining justice in the community he'd helped liberate from Miller's grip. Thomas spotted her and approached, gesturing to the badge with a mixture of resignation and determination. "Never thought I'd wear one of these," he admitted. "Your mother's going to have plenty to say about it." Victoria smiled, imagining Margaret's reaction. "She'll support you. We all will." Thomas glanced toward the jail, understanding dawning in his weathered face. "Miller wanted to see his son." Victoria nodded. "James is in there now." "Brave boy," Thomas observed. "Facing that man again can't be easy." He studied his daughter thoughtfully. "You care for him?" It wasn't a question, and Victoria didn't treat it as one. "He's a good man who's been through an ordeal. We all have." Thomas wasn't fooled by her evasion. "Just be careful, Vicky. Not because he's Miller's son, he's proven himself better than his blood, but because both of you are carrying wounds that need time to heal." "I know, Pa," Victoria assured him. "We're taking things slowly, one day at a time." Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer. "I need to meet with my new deputies," he said, still sounding slightly bewildered by his change in status. "Will you be all right here?" "I'm fine," Victoria promised. "I'll see you back at the ranch for supper." After her father departed, Victoria found a bench outside the general store where she could wait for James while observing the transformation taking place in Redemption. Already, there was a lightness to the town, a sense of possibility that had been suppressed under Miller's shadow. Nearly 30 minutes passed before James emerged from the jailhouse. Even from a distance, Victoria could see that the meeting had affected him deeply. His face was composed but pale, his movements deliberate as he crossed the street to join her. "How was it?" she asked simply when he reached her. James sat beside her gathering his thoughts before responding. Strange. He was different, smaller somehow. Without his power, his influence, he seemed diminished. He shook his head slowly. He wanted to justify himself, explain why his actions were necessary, why I should understand his choices. And did you understand, perhaps in the most clinical sense, the progression from ambitious doctor to war criminal to corrupt businessman? I can trace the path intellectually. James's expression hardened. But accept, forgive, no. Some crimes are beyond redemption. Victoria nodded under dangers. The finality in his tone. What will you do now? Move forward, James replied, echoing their earlier conversation. Start building something better from the ashes of his legacy. He turned to face her directly. I've made a decision about the railroad land. Victoria raised an eyebrow, curious. The government will eventually reinstate the railroad project under new management, James explained. The right-of-way through Henderson and Harrison land will still be needed. But instead of seizing it, I've proposed fair market value 5 times what my father offered, plus profit sharing from the shipping revenue for any landowner affected by the route. Victoria's eyes widened at this creative solution. That's generous. It's just, James corrected. The railroad brings prosperity, but that prosperity should be shared with those who sacrifice for it. It's a new model, one I hope will be adopted throughout the territories. The vision was compelling a more equitable approach to progress, one that respected the rights and contributions of the very settlers who had tamed this wilderness. My father would consider that proposal, Victoria said thoughtfully. It addresses his main concern, fair compensation for land that's been in our family for years. And William Harrison, James asked, would he consider it? I think he might, Victoria replied, especially with his new focus on rebuilding his medical practice. The additional income would provide security for Charlotte's future. James nodded, satisfied. Then that's where I'll start, building bridges instead of burning them. They sat together as the afternoon lengthened, discussing practical possibilities for Redemption's future, the railroad's eventual completion, the development of proper medical facilities with William's expertise, the establishment of reliable law enforcement under Thomas's leadership. Gradually, their conversation shifted to more personal matters, James's childhood in Boston, before his father's railroad ambitions brought them west. Victoria's education in Philadelphia, interrupted by the war and Robert's death. Their shared love of literature and music, discovered in this unlikely meeting of souls on the Wyoming frontier. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in golds and ambers, Victoria realized they had been talking for hours, the time passing unnoticed in the pleasure of genuine connection. I should head back to the ranch, she said reluctantly. My parents will be waiting. James rose, offering his hand to help her up, a gentlemanly gesture that seemed both formal and intimate in this transformed relationship between them. May I call on you? He asked directly. Properly with your father's knowledge. No more midnight conspiracies or desperate plans. Victoria couldn't help but smile at the contrast between their early encounters and this courtship proposal. I'd like that, she replied honestly, though I should warn you, Sheriff Henderson may prove more intimidating than Rancher Henderson. James laughed, the sound surprising and delightful in its uninhibited joy. I've faced Colonel Miller's wrath and survived. I think I can handle your father's protective instincts. As they walked toward the livery stable where Victoria's horse waited, they passed William and Charlotte, emerging from the cafe, the precious packet of letters carefully secured in William's coat pocket. Both appeared emotionally drained, but somehow lighter, as if a great burden had begun to lift from their shoulders. "Victoria," William called, approaching with Charlotte at his side. "We're heading home. I wanted to thank you for being there today. It meant a great deal to both of us." "No thanks needed," Victoria assured him. "I'm honored you wanted me there." Charlotte, who had been quiet and withdrawn since the confrontation with Miller, stepped forward to embrace Victoria unexpectedly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for helping us find the truth about Mother." Victoria returned the embrace, struck by how much older Charlotte seemed than her 18 years forged in the crucible of recent events into a young woman of remarkable strength and grace. As William and Charlotte continued toward their waiting wagon, James watched them with thoughtful eyes. "They have a long road ahead," he observed, "but they have each other and the truth, finally." "Sometimes that's enough," Victoria replied. "Truth, family, a chance to rebuild." They reached the livery stable where Victoria's mare waited impatiently for the ride home. James helped her mount his hands, lingering briefly on her waist, a touch that spoke of caring and possibility. "Until next time," he said, looking up at her. Victoria smiled down at him, her heart lighter than it had been in years, despite the challenges that still lay ahead. "Until next time," she agreed. As she rode out of Redemption toward the Henderson Ranch, Victoria felt a sense of rightness settling over her, a belief that after the darkness they had endured, a new dawn was truly breaking, not just for her family or for the town, but for all of them who had stood together against Miller's corruption and cruelty. The path forward would not be easy. There would be Miller's trial to face testimony, to give old wounds still healing. But for the first time in years, Victoria allowed herself to imagine a future filled with more than just survival, a future that might include purpose, community, and perhaps even love. The Wyoming landscape stretched before her, bathed in the golden light of sunset, harsh in its beauty, unforgiving in its demands, but filled with possibility for those strong enough to embrace both its challenges and its rewards. On this frontier where law had finally triumphed over lawlessness, where justice had begun to take root in soil once poisoned by corruption, Victoria Henderson rode toward home with her head high and her heart open to whatever tomorrow might bring. Behind her, Redemption lived up to its name, at last a place of second chances, of healing, of new beginnings for all who had been wounded by the past, but refused to be defined by it. As the Henderson Ranch came into view, Victoria saw her mother standing on the porch, waiting as she always did until her family was safely home. Margaret raised a hand in greeting, and Victoria returned the gesture, carrying with her the promise of a story that would take all evening to tell, a story of endings and beginnings, of justice long delayed, but finally served, of a community transformed through courage and sacrifice. It was a story still being written, its final chapters yet to unfold. But as Victoria Henderson dismounted and embraced her mother in the fading light of this momentous day, she knew with certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, family, friends, and former enemies united by their shared vision of a more just and honorable frontier. In this harsh and beautiful land, they had found not just survival, but redemption. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of all. End of Part 5, story complete.